close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are standing in the middle of the desert 4,500 years ago, watching the sun rise over the world's first empire. The sand beneath your feet has witnessed something humanity has never seen before. One man's dream of uniting the entire world under a single ruler. Tonight, we're traveling back to 2334 BC, the year the concept of empire was born. This is the story of Akkad, the story of Sargon, the story of how ambition and vision changed everything we know about civilization. Before we begin this journey together, I'd love to know, where are you right now? Are you lying in bed in New York, perhaps driving through the quiet streets of California, or anywhere in the world? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're joining us from and what time it is in your world. If you enjoy deep adventures in ancient history, stories that make you think and relax, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us reach more people who, like you, appreciate history told in depth and detail. Now, let's go back in time together. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Empires. What is an empire? It's a question worth sitting with for a moment, letting it settle in your mind like dust after a long wind. We use the word so casually today. The British Empire, the Roman Empire, even corporate empires, empires of influence, empires of technology. But what does it really mean? At its heart, an empire is more than just conquered land. It's more than armies and tribute and golden palaces. An empire is an idea made manifest, a vision that says the world doesn't have to be a collection of separate, warring pieces. It says that unity, however forced or fragile, is possible. That one law, one language, one administrative system can stretch across mountains and rivers and deserts, binding people who've never met into a single political body. But someone had to think of that first. Someone had to look at the fractured, competitive, endlessly warring landscape of ancient civilization and say, what if we could bring all of this together? That someone was a man named Sargon, and the place where this happened was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the cradle of everything we call civilization. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world together. Not with dramatic flourishes or thundering battle cries, but slowly, thoughtfully, the way you might walk through ruins at dusk, running your fingers along stones that once held up palaces, wondering about the hands that placed them there. Let's begin with the land itself. Mesopotamia. The word comes from Greek, meaning between the rivers. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, two mighty waterways that flow down from the mountains of what we now call Turkey, cutting through the landscape until they reach the Persian Gulf. Between these rivers, in the flat alluvial plains, where the soil is rich and black from thousands of years of flooding, humanity learned to farm, to build, to write, to dream of permanence. This is around 5,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The pyramids of Egypt haven't been built yet. Stonehenge is just a collection of wooden posts. The Minoan civilization of Crete is still centuries away. But here, in Mesopotamia, people have already created something remarkable. They've created cities, not villages, not tribal camps. Cities. Uruk, with its massive temple complexes and tens of thousands of inhabitants. Ur, with its ziggurat rising like a mountain toward the heavens. Lagash, Kish, Nippur, Umma. Each one a world unto itself, with walls, with laws, with kings and priests and scribes who keep records in wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay tablets. The Sumerians, as we call them, had built the world's first urban civilization. They had writing, cuneiform, possibly the first writing system ever developed. They had mathematics, using a base 60 counting system that we still use today when we measure time and angles. They had law codes, religious epics, astronomical observations. They had invented the wheel, the plough, the sailboat. But they hadn't invented unity. Each city was its own kingdom, ruled by its own ensi or lugal, its own governor or king. And these cities were constantly at war with each other. Not the sweeping, empire-building wars we'd see later in history, but small, bitter, endless conflicts over water rights, over boundary stones, over insults real or imagined. A canal diverted here. a field claimed there. One city's god supposedly insulted by another city's god. It was exhausting. Generations lived and died in this pattern of competition and conflict. Resources that could have built wonders were spent on walls and weapons. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents from this period, records dynasty after dynasty, city after city, claiming kingship, only to lose it to another city in another war. Imagine that world for a moment. Imagine being a farmer in one of these cities, working the fields outside the walls, never quite sure if this year would bring peace, or if the army from the city 20 miles away would come marching over the horizon. Imagine being a merchant, trying to trade between cities that might be allies one year and enemies the next. Imagine being a scribe, recording the glorious victories of your king, knowing that in a generation, some other scribe in some other city would be recording your city's defeat. This was the world into which Sargon was born. A world of genius and accomplishment, yes, but also a world of fragmentation. A world waiting, though it didn't know it, for someone to imagine something different. Now, before we meet Sargon himself, let's sit with this question of empire a bit longer. Because it matters. It matters to understanding what happened next, and it matters to understanding our own world. When we look back at history from our vantage point in the 21st century, we see empires everywhere. We see the logical progression. Tribes become kingdoms. Kingdoms become empires. Empires spread across continents. It seems almost inevitable. Natural. Of course, people would try to conquer and unify. Of course, the strong would seek to dominate the weak. Of course, ambitious rulers would dream of world conquest. But it wasn't inevitable. Nothing in history is. For hundreds of years, the brilliant Sumerian civilization thrived without anyone seriously attempting to unify it all. Sure, individual cities would gain temporary dominance. Kish might control several other cities for a generation. Uruk might command tribute from its neighbors. But the idea of one permanent, centralized government ruling over all of Mesopotamia, that wasn't part of the mental landscape. Why not? Perhaps because the city-state system worked well enough. Each city had its identity, its patron deity, its traditions. Unity might have seemed not just difficult but somehow wrong, a violation of the natural order. The gods themselves, after all, had divided the land among themselves in the old stories. Who was a mortal king to overturn that divine arrangement? Or perhaps it was simply that no one had figured out how yet. Empire building requires more than military strength. It requires administrative systems that can function across distance. It requires communication networks. It requires the ability to project power not just in one dramatic campaign, but year after year, generation after generation. It requires, above all, a vision compelling enough to make people believe in something larger than their city walls. Sargon would provide that vision. But he'd also have to invent the practical mechanisms to make it real. Let's talk about what the world looked like in the decades before Sargon rose to power. This is around 2400 BC, give or take. To put that in perspective, this is roughly as far in the past for the ancient Greeks as the ancient Greeks are for us. When Plato and Aristotle were pondering philosophy in Athens, the Akkadian Empire was already an ancient memory, something from the misty beginnings of time. But in this moment, in the mid-24th century BC, the Sumerian world is vibrant and alive. In Uruk, priests climb the steps of the great ziggurat, offering prayers to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. In Ur, merchants count out silver shekels, weighing them on balanced scales, recording transactions in neat columns of cuneiform. In Lagash, artisans craft cylinder seals, tiny works of art in stone that will be rolled across wet clay to mark ownership and authority. The population of Mesopotamia at this time is hard to estimate, but the major cities each held tens of thousands of people. Taken together, we're talking about a civilization of perhaps several 100,000 souls, maybe more, all living in this relatively small area between the two rivers, farming the rich soil, building temples to their gods, writing poetry and prayers, and business contracts. It was, by any measure, an impressive achievement, but it was also fragile. The problem with city-states is that they're inherently competitive. When you have multiple independent centers of power in close proximity, each with its own interests and ambitions, conflict is almost unavoidable. And in Mesopotamia, the resources that made civilization possible, water, above all, were things that could be controlled, diverted, weaponized. A city upstream on a canal could cut off water to a city downstream. A city with control of a strategic trade route could enrich itself at others' expense. And of course, there was always the simple human desire for prestige, for dominance, for the ability to say, "We are greater than you." The wars weren't constant. There were periods of peace, times when cities cooperated, when trade flourished, when cultural achievements reached new heights. But the wars always came back, and they were getting worse. By the time Sargon appears in the historical record, one king in particular had managed to dominate much of Sumer. His name was Lugal-Zaggisi, and he ruled from Uruk. He claimed to have conquered from the Lower Sea, the Persian Gulf, to the Upper Sea, the Mediterranean. Whether he actually did is debatable, but clearly he was the most powerful ruler in Mesopotamia. Lugal-Zaggisi called himself the king of the land, the priest of the sky god Anu, the great Ensi of the goddess Enlil. He boasted of his conquests in inscriptions. He seemed, for a moment, to have achieved something like the unity that had eluded others. But Lugal-Zaggisi's unification was built on conquest without integration. He ruled through force, through the temporary submission of defeated cities. He hadn't created new institutions or new ways of thinking. He'd just been more successful, for a time, at the old game of city versus city. Sargon would play a different game entirely. Now, think for a moment about what it means to be the first at something. We celebrate firsts. First person to climb a mountain. First person to run a 4-minute mile. First person on the moon. There's something special about being first, about doing what no one has done before. But being first also means you have no template, no one to learn from, no mistakes to avoid because no one has made them yet. When Sargon set out to build the first empire, he couldn't look at previous empires and think, well, that worked for them, so I'll do that too. He had to invent it as he went. And in a way, that's what makes the Akkadian Empire so fascinating. Not just that it was first, but that it had to figure out everything from scratch. How do you govern multiple cities with different traditions? How do you collect taxes fairly across a large area? How do you keep distant regions loyal? How do you balance central control with local autonomy? How do you create a sense of shared identity among people who've always thought of themselves as belonging to this city or that city, never to something larger? These aren't just ancient questions. We're still wrestling with them today. The tension between local and central authority, between unity and diversity, between the efficiency of centralization and the vitality of local culture. Sargon was the first to grapple with these puzzles on this scale. So where does our story really begin? It begins, as so many great stories do, with a nobody. A man with no royal blood, no inherited claim to power, no obvious destiny. Just ambition. Just vision. Just the willingness to imagine that the world could be different than it had always been. His name, in the Akkadian language, was Sharukin. We know him as Sargon. And the name he chose for himself tells us something important. Sharukin means the true king or the legitimate king. It's a statement, a claim. This man, whoever he was before, whatever his origins, was declaring himself the rightful ruler, not of a city, of the world. The legends that grew up around Sargon's birth are remarkably similar to other hero stories from across cultures. They say his mother was a high priestess who bore him in secret, that she placed him in a basket of reeds, sealed with pitch, and set him afloat on the river, that he was found and raised by a gardener, a man of humble station, that he rose through his abilities and his character to catch the attention of the king of Kish, becoming the king's cupbearer, a position of trust and intimacy. It's a good story. Maybe it's even true, in broad strokes. Or maybe it's a story Sargon himself encouraged, a way of framing his rise in terms that people could understand and accept. The abandoned child who rises to greatness. The hidden king revealed. It's a narrative that transcends cultures and centuries. What we know for certain is that Sargon was associated with the city of Kish in northern Mesopotamia, in the land of Akkad. And at some point, through means that aren't entirely clear, he took power. Not in Kish itself, but in a new city he founded, a city called Akkad. And from that city, from that base of power, he would launch the conquests that would change everything. But before we follow him into battle, let's take a moment to appreciate the audacity of what he was attempting. Sargon wasn't content to be the king of Kish, an already significant city. He wasn't content to dominate a few neighboring cities and call himself great. He wanted something unprecedented. He wanted to unite all of Mesopotamia under a single rule. He wanted to create something that had never existed before, an empire. The word he used for himself, once he'd achieved his conquests, was king of the universe. Not king of Akkad, not king of Sumer, king of the universe. The whole world, as far as he knew it. We might smile at that today, knowing how vast the actual world is. But from his perspective, from the perspective of someone living in Mesopotamia in the 24th century BC, the known world was Mesopotamia and the lands immediately surrounding it, the mountains to the north and east, the deserts to the west and south, the seas at either end. That was the universe. And Sargon intended to rule it all. As we prepare to follow Sargon's story in the next part of our journey, let's hold on to a few thoughts. First, that empires don't arise from nowhere. They emerge from specific contexts, specific moments when the old order is breaking down and something new becomes possible. The Sumerian city-state system was brilliant, but it was also exhausted, trapped in endless cycles of competition and conflict. Sargon offered an alternative. Second, that empire building requires more than military might. It requires vision, administration, the ability to think systematically about large-scale organization. Sargon wasn't just a great general. He was a great organizer, a great innovator in the arts of government. And third, that the first time something happens in history, it echoes forward through the centuries. The Akkadian Empire would last less than 200 years, but the idea of empire, once planted, would never die. Every subsequent conqueror, from the Babylonians to the Assyrians to the Persians to Alexander to Rome, would be following in Sargon's footsteps, whether they knew it or not. The world before Sargon was a world of city-states, of small kingdoms, of localized power. The world after Sargon would always know that empire was possible. That unity, however temporary, could be achieved. That one man, with sufficient vision and will, could reshape the entire political landscape. It's a profound legacy. And it all begins in the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia, with a man who called himself the true king, standing at the gates of his new city, looking out at a world he intended to conquer. Everything that seems inevitable once was impossible. Every empire once was just an idea in one person's mind. And the distance between impossible and inevitable is crossed by people willing to imagine the world differently than it is. Sargon imagined an empire, and then he built one. Chapter 2. Before the Storm, the Sumerian World. To understand what Sargon destroyed, we first need to understand what he found. And what he found was perhaps the most sophisticated civilization the world had yet seen. The Sumerian world, in the centuries before Sargon, was a marvel. Not a unified marvel, not an organized marvel, but a marvel nonetheless. It was a constellation of brilliant cities, each one a center of innovation and culture, each one convinced of its own supremacy, each one locked in an endless dance of competition with its neighbors. Let's walk through that world together, slowly, the way you might walk through a museum after hours, when the crowds have gone and you can really look at things, really let them speak to you. Imagine, if you will, approaching the city of Uruk from the desert. You've been walking for days, following one of the ancient trade routes that crisscross Mesopotamia like veins carrying life through a body. The sun is brutal. The air shimmers with heat. Your water skin is nearly empty. And then, on the horizon, you see it. Walls. Massive mud brick walls, rising from the flat plain like a man-made mountain. These aren't small fortifications. The walls of Uruk stretch for nearly 6 miles, encircling an area of about 2.5 square miles. By the standards of the mid-3rd millennium BC, this is enormous. This is a city that holds, perhaps, 50,000 people. Maybe more. As you get closer, the details emerge. Gates, heavily guarded, where merchants and travelers are questioned, before being allowed entry. Towers along the walls, where sentries watch the horizon. And beyond the walls, visible even from a distance, the great ziggurat, the temple of Anu and Inanna, rising in stepped levels toward the sky. You pass through the gates. Inside, the city is a maze. Narrow streets wind between buildings made of mud brick, most of them 2 or 3 stories tall. The wealthier homes have courtyards, private spaces hidden from the street. The poorer homes crowd together, sharing walls, their small windows high up to keep out the worst of the heat and the dust. The sounds are overwhelming if you're not used to cities. Merchants calling out their wares, donkeys braying, children playing, the rhythmic thud of a weaver's loom, the ring of a metalsmith's hammer, the low chant of priests from the temple precinct. The city breathes, lives, pulses with human activity. In the center of Uruk stands the Iana district, the sacred precinct dedicated to Inanna. Here, the buildings are grander, the decoration more elaborate. Colored cones of baked clay are pressed into the mud brick walls in geometric patterns, creating mosaics that catch the light. The temple itself is vast, its interior cool and dim, smelling of incense and oil. Priests move through these spaces with practiced grace. They're not just religious figures. In Sumerian cities, the temple is the economic heart of the community. The priests manage vast estates, organize labor, store grain, loan out seed and tools. They're accountants as much as holy men, tracking everything in meticulous cuneiform records pressed into clay tablets. This is Uruk, one of the oldest cities in the world, the legendary home of Gilgamesh, the hero king whose story would be told and retold for thousands of years. A city of culture, of learning, of power. But Uruk is just one city. Let's visit another. South of Uruk, closer to the Persian Gulf, lies Ur. If you've heard of any Sumerian city, it's probably Ur of the Chaldees, mentioned in the Bible as the birthplace of Abraham, though that's much later, long after the time we're talking about now. Ur in the 24th century BC is different from Uruk in character, though similar in sophistication. Where Uruk is dominated by the worship of Inanna, Ur belongs to Nana, the moon god. The great ziggurat of Ur, portions of which still stand today, more than 4,000 years later, was dedicated to Nana. Ur is a trading city. Its position near the coast makes it a natural hub for maritime commerce. Ships arrive from down the Gulf, from places the Sumerians called Dilmun and Magan, modern Bahrain and Oman. These ships bring copper, timber, precious stones, exotic goods from lands the average Sumerian will never see. The merchants of Ur are wealthy. They live in substantial houses, 2 stories tall, built around central courtyards. Archaeologists, excavating these houses thousands of years later, would find treasures, golden jewelry, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian beads from the Indus Valley. The trade networks of the Sumerian world stretched far, far beyond Mesopotamia itself. But Ur, for all its wealth, is also vulnerable. Like all Sumerian cities, it depends on a complex irrigation system. Canals branch off from the Euphrates, carrying water to the fields where barley and dates grow in abundance. These canals require constant maintenance. They also require cooperation, or at least non-interference, from cities upstream. Water is power in Mesopotamia. Control the water, control the land. It's a lesson every Sumerian child learns, and it's a source of endless conflict. North of Ur, we find Lagash, another significant city-state. Lagash gives us some of our most detailed information about Sumerian life, thanks to thousands of clay tablets discovered there. Administrative records, mostly. Lists of workers, rations of grain, assignments of labor, the mundane details that, taken together, paint a vivid picture of how a Sumerian city actually functioned. Lagash, in this period, is ruled by a dynasty of Ensis, governors or priest-kings, who manage both the religious and secular affairs of the city. One of these rulers, Ernanche, left inscriptions describing his building projects. He dug canals. He built temples. He imported timber from distant mountains to roof his constructions. Standard stuff for a successful Sumerian ruler. But Lagash is also perpetually at war with its neighbor, Umma, over a disputed border region. This conflict goes on for generations. Rulers on both sides claim divine sanction for their position. Treaties are made and broken. Battle after battle is fought, with neither side able to achieve lasting victory. It's exhausting reading about these conflicts now. Imagine living through them. Imagine being a farmer whose field lies in the disputed zone, never knowing which city will claim authority over you this year. Imagine being a soldier, called up again and again to fight over the same strip of land, for reasons that probably seem increasingly abstract as the years go by. This is the Sumerian world. Brilliant, yes. Accomplished, absolutely. But also trapped in cycles of conflict that drain resources and energy that could be used for other things. Further north still, in the region that would become the heartland of Akkad, lies the city of Kish. Kish is significant for our story because this is where Sargon's career begins, as a servant in the court of the king of Kish. Kish has a special place in Sumerian political thought. The concept of kingship of Kish is used as a sort of claim to hegemony over all of Sumer. Various city rulers would claim the title King of Kish even if they didn't actually control the city, because the title carried prestige and implied a kind of supremacy. But like all claims to supremacy in the Sumerian world, it's contested and temporary. One city dominates for a generation, maybe two. Then it declines, or is defeated, and another city rises. The Sumerian king list, a document compiled centuries later, records this endless succession. Then Kish was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Eanna. Then Eanna was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Ur. Then Ur was defeated. On and on it goes, an accounting of impermanence, of the wheel of fortune turning and turning, lifting one city up only to cast it down again. Let's pause here and think about what holds this world together, such as it is. It's not political unity. We've established that. Each city is independent, sovereign, with its own ruler and its own interests. It's not ethnic unity, exactly. The Sumerians share a language and a cultural tradition, but they don't think of themselves as Sumerians in the way we might think of ourselves as Americans or French or Vietnamese. They think of themselves as people of Uruk, people of Ur, people of Lagash. City identity comes first. What holds them together is cultural continuity. Religion, above all. The Sumerian gods are shared across all the cities, though each city has its patron deity. Enlil, the king of the gods, has his chief temple in Nippur. Inanna belongs especially to Uruk, Nanna to Ur. But all Sumerians recognize all the gods, tell the same myths, perform similar rituals. Language is another bond. Sumerian is spoken and written throughout the region. The cuneiform script, with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, is understood by scribes from all the cities. A legal document written in Ur can be read in Lagash. A hymn composed in Uruk can be sung in Kish. And there are shared cultural practices. The way temples are built, the way kings are crowned, the way justice is administered, the basic structure of society, priests, kings, merchants, artisans, farmers, slaves. It's recognizable from city to city, even if the details vary. In a sense, Sumer is like ancient Greece would be 2,000 years later, a shared culture spread across independent city-states, united by language and religion and custom, but politically fragmented and often at war with one another. And like ancient Greece, this fragmentation is both a strength and a weakness. The strength is diversity, competition, innovation. When cities compete, they push each other to excellence. The art of one city inspires the art of another. The laws of one city are refined and improved in another. The competitive environment drives advancement. The weakness is obvious. Divided, the Sumerian cities can be conquered. Their conflicts with each other drain resources. They can't cooperate on large-scale projects or present a united front against external threats, and they're vulnerable to anyone who can figure out how to unite them by force. Let's talk about daily life for a moment. Because empires and conquests and political systems are important, but it's the texture of ordinary life that really helps us understand a civilization. If you were a typical person in a Sumerian city, what would your life look like? Well, first, the odds are good that you're a farmer. Most people are. You work land that might be owned by the temple or by a wealthy landowner. or possibly by your family if you're fortunate. You grow barley primarily, some wheat, dates from palm trees, onions, lentils, chickpeas in your garden. Your year is governed by the rhythm of the floods. The Tigris and Euphrates aren't like the Nile, flooding predictably and gently. They're wilder, more dangerous. Too much water and your crops drown. Too little and they wither. Managing water is everything. You spend a significant portion of your time maintaining irrigation ditches, clearing silt, making sure water flows where it's needed. Your home is simple. Mud brick, like everything in Mesopotamia. Wood is scarce and expensive, so your roof is probably just reeds covered with mud. In summer, when the heat is unbearable, you might sleep on the roof to catch any breeze. In winter, which is mild but can be rainy, you huddle inside. You eat barley bread, barley porridge, occasionally fish from the canals. If you're lucky, some dates, some onions. Meat is rare unless you're wealthy or it's a festival day. Beer is common, though. The Sumerians love beer. It's nutritious, safer than water, and mildly alcoholic. Even workers receive beer as part of their rations. If you're a woman, you might weave. Textile production is a major industry in Sumerian cities, and it's primarily women's work. You might work in one of the temple weaving workshops, part of a large team of women producing cloth that will be traded far and wide. If you're a man and not a farmer, you might be a craftsman. A potter, shaping clay on a wheel, creating the vessels that hold grain and oil and water. A metal worker, casting bronze tools and weapons. A builder, laying mud bricks in the endless construction and reconstruction that cities require. Or you might be a scribe. This is a prestigious position, one that requires years of training. Learning to read and write cuneiform is difficult. The script has hundreds of signs, many with multiple meanings depending on context. But literacy opens doors. Scribes are needed in the temples, in the palace, in the courts. They keep records, draft contracts, compose letters. It's skilled work, respected work. Your religion is woven into every aspect of life. The gods are real, present, active. They inhabit the statues in the temples. They receive offerings of food and drink. They can be pleased or angered. The prosperity of your city depends on maintaining good relationships with the gods, which is why the priests are so important and why so much of the city's wealth goes to the temples. You believe that humans were created to serve the gods, to provide them with food and worship. It's not a metaphor. It's literal truth, as far as you're concerned. The gods need you, in a sense, which gives life meaning. You have a cosmic purpose. When you die, you don't expect much. The Sumerian afterlife is a dreary place, a dark underworld where shades exist in a kind of half-life, eating dust and clay. The best you can hope for is to be remembered, to have your name spoken by your descendants, to have made some mark in the world of the living that outlasts your body. This is your world, bounded by city walls, governed by cycles of planting and harvest, ordered by the will of the gods as interpreted by priests and kings. It's a small world by our standards, but it's the only world you know, and it's held your people for longer than anyone can remember. Now, here's the thing about this Sumerian world. This constellation of competing cities. It's stable in a certain sense. Yes, there are wars, but they're limited wars. Rarely does one city completely destroy another. The goal is usually to assert dominance, extract tribute, perhaps control a disputed territory. But the basic system continues. Historians sometimes talk about this as a kind of equilibrium. No single city can permanently dominate all the others. Alliances form and break. Power shifts. But the fundamental structure, multiple independent city-states, persists generation after generation. Until it doesn't. By the mid-24th century BC, this equilibrium is under stress. The wars are getting bigger. The ambitions of individual rulers are growing, and one king in particular, Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma, is pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Lugal-Zaggisi is worth spending a moment on, because in a sense, he's the last great king of the Sumerian world, and also the one who inadvertently paves the way for its end. Lugal-Zaggisi starts as the Ensi of Umma, that city perpetually at war with Lagash over border disputes. But he's not content with Umma. He conquers Lagash, finally ending that long rivalry. Then he takes Uruk and makes it his capital. Then he systematically conquers or subordinates most of the other major Sumerian cities. By the time he's done, Lugal-Zaghazi controls virtually all of Sumer. He claims, in his inscriptions, to rule from the lower sea to the upper sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Whether he actually controlled territory that far west is debatable, but clearly he's the most powerful ruler Mesopotamia has seen up to this point. Lugal-Zaghazi does something interesting in his inscriptions. He asks the gods to grant him rule over the entire world, from sunrise to sunset, from the lower sea to the upper sea, and to make straight his path. He envisions, in other words, universal dominion. Not just supremacy over Sumer, but over everything. It's a bold vision, but Lugal-Zaghazi lacks the tools to make it permanent. He rules through force and the personal submission of defeated cities. He hasn't created new institutions or new ways of organizing power. He's playing the old game, just playing it better than anyone else has. And the old game has a weakness. It depends on the strength and skill of one man. When that man dies, or is defeated, everything can fall apart very quickly. Lugal-Zaghazi rules for about 25 years. During that time, he's the master of Mesopotamia. Kings pay him tribute. His name is feared and respected. But to the north, in the land of Akkad, a cupbearer to the king of Kish is watching, learning, planning. This cupbearer has his own vision of universal dominion. But unlike Lugal-Zaghazi, he's going to build something that lasts beyond his lifetime. His name is Sargon, and he's about to change everything. Before we move on to Sargon's conquests, let's take one last look at this Sumerian world in its final moments of independence. Picture the scribes in Uruk, carefully recording grain deliveries in cuneiform, unaware that within a few years their tablets will be written in a different language, Akkadian, though still using the same script. Picture the merchants of negotiating deals with traders from distant lands, not knowing that soon they'll be part of something much larger, an empire that will make trade even more profitable, but will also make their city just one among many, not special, not unique. Picture the farmers in their fields, watching the seasons turn as they always have, planting and harvesting, living lives not so different from their great-great-grandparents, not suspecting that the political world they take for granted is about to be swept away. There's something poignant about these last moments before everything changes. The Sumerian civilization isn't going to disappear. The language will continue to be used for religious and scholarly purposes for thousands of years. The culture will influence everything that comes after. But the political independence of the Sumerian cities, the system of competitive city-states that's endured for centuries, that's about to end. And in its place will come something new, something unprecedented, the world's first empire. But that empire won't erase what came before. It will build on it. Sargon and his successors will adopt Sumerian culture even as they subordinate Sumerian cities. They'll worship Sumerian gods, use Sumerian artistic styles, incorporate Sumerian learning. The relationship between Akkad and Sumer will be complex, a mixture of conquest and cultural admiration, of political dominance and intellectual deference. It's a pattern we'll see again and again in history. Rome conquering Greece, but being conquered in turn by Greek culture. The Mongols ruling China, but adopting Chinese administrative practices. The British Empire spreading English law and language, but being profoundly influenced by the cultures it encountered. Conquest is never simple. Power is never just about force. And civilization is never just about who has the biggest army. The Sumerian world is about to fall, but nothing is ever truly lost. It changes form. It becomes part of what comes next. And in that sense, the Sumerians never really disappeared at all. Chapter 3. The Man from Nowhere, Sargon's Rise. Every empire begins with a person. Not an institution, not an inevitable historical force, but a single human being who looks at the world and decides it should be different. In the case of the world's first empire, that person was a man who called himself Sargon. The true king, the legitimate king, a name chosen deliberately, almost defiantly, because whatever else Sargon was, he wasn't born to royalty. He had no dynasty behind him, no ancient lineage to justify his rule. He had only himself, his ambition, and his vision. Tonight, let's trace his path from obscurity to mastery. Not with trumpets and drama, but slowly, thoughtfully, the way you might trace the course of a river from its source, high in the mountains, down to the sea, following the current, watching it grow. The legends about Sargon's birth tell us more about how people wanted to remember him than about what actually happened. But the legends matter, because Sargon himself may have encouraged them. Understanding that power isn't just about force, but about narrative, about the stories people tell themselves to make sense of who rules them and why. The legend goes like this. Sargon's mother was a high priestess, a woman of status and education, though the legend doesn't name her. His father is unknown, or at least unacknowledged. In Sumerian society, this is a problem. Children need legitimate fathers, especially children of priestesses, who are supposed to maintain ritual purity. So the mother makes a choice. She bears the child in secret. She fashions a basket from reeds, the same reeds that grow thick along the riverbanks of Mesopotamia. She seals the basket with bitumen, the natural tar that seeps from the ground in certain places, making the basket waterproof. She places her infant son inside, and she sets the basket afloat on the river, committing the child to whatever fate the gods have in store. The basket drifts. Perhaps it catches in eddies, spinning in slow circles. Perhaps it runs rapids, bouncing and tilting dangerously. But it stays afloat, and eventually, it's found. The man who finds it is named Akki. He's a gardener, a man who works with his hands, who tends the date palms and vegetable plots that feed the city. He's not nobility, not a priest or a warrior or a merchant, just an ordinary working man. Akki pulls the basket from the water. He opens it, and he finds a baby, alive, unharmed. He makes a choice too. He takes the child home. He raises him as his own. Does any of this actually happen? We don't know. But notice how familiar the story is. A child of mysterious origin, set adrift on a river, found and raised by common folk, destined for greatness. It's the story of Moses, who won't be born for centuries yet. It's the story of Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome. It's a story humans tell again and again across cultures and centuries. It's the story of the hidden king, the rightful ruler whose true nature is concealed until the proper moment. It's a way of explaining how someone with no apparent claim to power can legitimately seize it. He was always meant to rule. The gods had a plan. His humble beginnings are part of that plan, not a contradiction of his right to reign. Whether Sargon was actually found in a basket by a gardener, or whether this is a story crafted later to explain his rise, it tells us something important. Sargon didn't come from the established ruling class. He was an outsider, and that outsider status, rather than being a weakness, became part of his mystique. What we know with more certainty is that at some point, the young man who would become Sargon entered the service of the king of Kish. He became a cupbearer, one of the most trusted positions in an ancient royal court. Let's think about what a cupbearer actually does, because the title sounds simple, but the role is anything but. A cupbearer serves wine to the king. That's the basic job description. But in a world where poisoning is a real and constant threat, where assassination is a political tool, the person who handles the king's drink must be absolutely trustworthy. The cupbearer tastes the wine before the king drinks it. If it's poisoned, the cupbearer dies instead of the king. This means the cupbearer is constantly in the king's presence. He attends private meetings. He hears confidential conversations. He sees the king at vulnerable moments, when the king has let down his guard. The cupbearer must be loyal, discreet, intelligent. It's a position of enormous trust and, therefore, enormous opportunity. In the court of Kish, Sargon serves the king whose name has come down to us as Ur-Zababa. We don't know much about Ur-Zababa. He's a minor figure in the grand sweep of history, remembered mainly because his cupbearer would go on to do extraordinary things. But for Sargon, these years as a cupbearer are an education. He learns how courts function, how power operates, how alliances are made and broken, how to read people, to understand their motivations, to anticipate their actions. He learns about military organization, about diplomatic negotiations, about the administration of a city-state, and he learns about the larger world. Kish is in northern Mesopotamia, in the region that speaks Akkadian rather than Sumerian. From here, Sargon can see both the Sumerian cities to the south, wealthy and cultured but fragmented and weak, and the opportunities to the north and west, the lands that aren't yet part of any organized state. Somewhere in these years, an idea forms, or perhaps an ambition. Perhaps just a simple realization, I could do this better. The exact sequence of events that leads to Sargon taking power is lost to time. Ancient sources give us fragments, hints, contradictory accounts, but the outcome is clear. Sargon doesn't inherit Kish. He doesn't conquer it in battle. He simply takes it, in some kind of internal coup or revolution. Maybe Ur-Zababa dies and Sargon seizes the moment. Maybe Sargon actively overthrows him. Maybe there's a succession crisis and Sargon emerges as the winner. We don't know. What we do know is that Sargon doesn't make Kish his capital. Instead, he founds a new city. He calls it Agade, which we pronounce as Akkad. And this city, not Kish, will be the center of his power. The location of Akkad is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. Despite thousands of years of looking, despite the fame of the city, despite the empire that bore its name, no one has definitively found the ruins of Akkad. Somewhere in central Iraq, probably near modern Baghdad, there's a tell, a mound of ancient ruins that covers what was once the greatest city in the world. But we haven't identified it with certainty. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The first imperial capital, lost. The city that gave its name to an empire, to a language, to an entire era of history, buried under sand and time, its location forgotten. But in Sargon's time, Akkad is very real. It's a new foundation, a city without centuries of tradition weighing it down. Sargon can organize it the way he wants. He can build it to serve his purposes. It's a clean slate, a fresh start, unencumbered by the expectations and limitations of an established urban center. From Akkad, Sargon begins to build his power base. He recruits soldiers. He forges alliances. He accumulates the resources he'll need for what comes next. Because Sargon has a plan. And that plan is nothing less than the conquest of all Mesopotamia. Let's pause here and think about what's going through Sargon's mind. What makes a person look at the established order and decide to overturn it completely? Part of it is probably personality. Some people are simply more ambitious than others, more willing to take risks, more confident in their abilities. Sargon clearly has these traits in abundance. But it's not just individual psychology. It's also circumstance. Sargon lives at a moment when the old order is visibly failing. The Sumerian city-states are exhausted by endless wars. Resources are being wasted on conflicts that settle nothing. Lugal-Sagesi has shown that Sumer can be unified by force, but his unification is shallow, personal, temporary. Sargon sees an opportunity. The Sumerian cities are weak. They're divided. They can be conquered. And once conquered, they can be held, if someone is smart enough to create the administrative systems that Lugal-Sagesi lacks. But there's something else too, something harder to quantify. Vision. Sargon isn't just an opportunist. He genuinely believes in something larger. He believes in the possibility of universal rule, of bringing order to chaos, of uniting the fractured world into a harmonious whole. Is this belief sincere, or is it rationalization? Does Sargon truly think he's serving some higher purpose, or is he just good at justifying his ambition to himself and others? We can't know his inner thoughts. Maybe he doesn't even know himself. Motivation is rarely pure or simple. What matters is that Sargon acts. He doesn't just dream of empire. He builds one. The conquests begin sometime around 2000-334 BC, give or take a few years. Dating in this period is imprecise, based on archaeological evidence and later king lists that may not be entirely accurate. But 2334 BC is the traditional date, the one that appears in textbooks, so let's use it as our marker. Sargon's first target is the Sumerian heartland, the rich cities of the south, the centers of civilization and wealth. This is the prize. Control Sumer, control the world as far as anyone in Mesopotamia is concerned. But between Sargon in Akkad and the Sumerian cities stands Lugal-Sagesi. Remember him. The king of Uruk, the man who's already conquered most of Sumer, who styles himself king of the land, who claims rule from sea to sea. Lugal-Zaghazi is the obstacle. Defeat him, and everything else becomes possible. The battle, when it comes, is decisive. We don't know the details. No ancient chronicler describes the tactics, the movement of troops, the flow of combat, but the outcome is recorded clearly enough. Sargon wins. Lugal-Zaghazi is captured. One account says that Sargon brought Lugal-Zaghazi to Nippur in a neckstock, a wooden collar that immobilizes the head, and displayed him at the gate of the temple of Enlil. A public humiliation. A demonstration to all of Sumer that the old order is finished, that a new power has arrived. It's brutal. It's calculated. It's effective. With Lugal-Zaghazi defeated, the Sumerian cities face a choice. Submit to this new conqueror from the north, or resist and risk destruction. Most choose submission. It's the practical choice. Lugal-Zaghazi was Sumerian, one of their own, and they couldn't maintain unity under him. What chance do they have against this Akkadian upstart with his disciplined army and his ruthless efficiency? City after city opens its gates. Uruk, Lagash, Umma. Kish, of course, where Sargon started. Nippur, the religious center, the home of Enlil, king of the gods. One by one, they acknowledge Sargon as their master. The traditional number given in later sources is 34. Sargon conquered 34 cities. Whether that's exact or symbolic, a way of saying very many, it conveys the scale of the achievement. The entire Sumerian world, the most advanced civilization on Earth, falls to one man in what seems to have been a relatively brief campaign. But Sargon understands something crucial. Conquest is only the beginning. The hard part is what comes after. How do you hold an empire together? How do you prevent the conquered cities from rebelling the moment you turn your attention elsewhere? Lugal-Zaghazi's mistake was ruling through personal submission and fear. As long as he was strong, people obeyed. But that kind of power is fragile. It depends entirely on the continuing strength and presence of one individual. Sargon takes a different approach. He creates systems. First, he installs governors. Not local rulers who might develop independent power bases, but Akkadians. Men loyal to Sargon personally. Men who owe their positions entirely to him. These governors administer the conquered cities, collect taxes, maintain order, report back to Akkad. Second, he establishes a standing army. This is revolutionary. Most armies in this period are militias, farmers called up for campaigns and then sent home when the fighting's done. Sargon maintains a permanent force. The traditional number is 5,400 men, eating at his table every day, meaning they're fed by the king, dependent on him, loyal to him, ready to march at any time. A standing army solves multiple problems. It provides security against external threats. It deters rebellion from conquered cities. And it allows for rapid response to any crisis. Sargon doesn't have to spend weeks assembling an army when trouble arises. He already has one, trained and ready. Third, Sargon promotes the Akkadian language. Not violently, not by suppressing Sumerian, but simply by making Akkadian the language of administration. If you want to work in the government, if you want to advance in the new order, you need to speak Akkadian. Over time, this linguistic shift will have profound effects, spreading Akkadian throughout Mesopotamia, making it the lingua franca of the region for centuries to come. These aren't the only innovations, but they're the crucial ones. Governors, army, language. The three pillars of imperial administration. Every empire that comes after, whether they know it or not, will use some version of Sargon's template. Now, with Sumer under control, Sargon could have stopped. He'd already achieved more than any previous ruler. He'd unified Mesopotamia. He could have spent the rest of his reign consolidating, enjoying his success, going down in history as the man who brought peace to the land between the rivers. But Sargon isn't interested in being just another king. He has a larger vision. He calls himself king of the universe, king of the 4 quarters of the world. And to make that title meaningful, he needs to expand beyond Mesopotamia itself. So the campaigns continue, north into the mountains, into the lands that will later be called Assyria. west toward the Mediterranean into Syria and Lebanon, east toward Elam, the region that's now southwestern Iran, even, according to some accounts, across the sea to Cyprus, though this is harder to verify. The goal isn't just conquest for its own sake, though Sargon certainly enjoys victory. The goal is strategic. Sargon wants to control the trade routes, the precious cedar wood from Lebanon, the copper from Cyprus and Anatolia, the tin from Afghanistan that, combined with copper, makes bronze, the lapis lazuli from the distant east, prized for its deep blue color. Control these resources and their trade routes, and you control wealth. Wealth buys loyalty. Loyalty maintains empire. It's a sophisticated understanding of power, not just military power, but economic power. Not just forcing people to obey, but making it profitable for them to cooperate. Let's think for a moment about what this means on a human level. About the experience of living through this transformation. If you're a young person in Uruk when Sargon conquers the city, your world has just been turned upside down. The king you knew, maybe respected or feared, is gone. Defeated. Humiliated. In his place is a foreigner, speaking a different language, worshipping the same gods, but with different names, imposing new laws and new systems. Everything you took for granted is suddenly uncertain. Will the temple still function the same way? Will your family's property be respected? Will the festivals still be celebrated? What does it mean to be from Uruk, when Uruk is no longer independent, but just one city among many in something called the Akkadian Empire? Some people probably embrace the change. There are always those who see opportunity in disruption, who attach themselves to the new regime and rise with it. Merchants who recognize that a larger empire means larger markets, scribes who learn Akkadian and find positions in the new administration, priests who cooperate with the conquerors and maintain their influence. Others resist, at least initially. There are rebellions in the sources, revolts that Sargon or his successors have to put down, the instinct to restore the old order, to throw off foreign rule, to reclaim independence. But over time, a generation or two, something shifts. The empire becomes normal. Children grow up never having known anything else. The idea of Uruk as an independent city-state becomes history, then legend, then barely remembered at all. This is how empires work, not just through force, though force is part of it, but through the slow transformation of consciousness. What's imposed becomes accepted. What's accepted becomes traditional. And tradition, eventually, feels like the natural order of things. Sargon rules for 56 years. That's the traditional number, and it's plausible. Long enough to accomplish everything he accomplished, but not impossibly long for a successful ruler in the ancient world. 56 years. Think about that. Think about how much the world changes in 56 years. When Sargon begins his conquests, the Sumerian city-states are independent, as they've been for centuries. When he dies, there's an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, administered from a single capital, united under a single ruler. In one man's lifetime, the entire political structure of the ancient Near East is remade. And it's not just politics. It's culture. It's economics. It's the way people think about themselves and their place in the world. Sargon doesn't just conquer territory. He conquers the imagination. He makes empire thinkable, desirable, the obvious way to organize large-scale political life. Before Sargon, when Sumerian scribes wrote about politics, they wrote about city kings and their conflicts. After Sargon, they write about empires and universal rule. The conceptual framework itself has shifted. But who is Sargon, really? Beyond the titles and the conquests and the legend, who is this man? We don't know. We can't know. The sources don't give us that kind of intimate detail. We have his accomplishments, recorded in inscriptions and later chronicles. We have the legend of his birth, which may or may not reflect reality. We have the administrative systems he creates, which tell us about his practical intelligence and his strategic thinking. But his personality, his inner life, whether he's kind to his children or cruel to his servants, whether he believes his own propaganda or sees himself as a clever fraud, whether he lies awake at night worrying about the empire or sleeps soundly, confident in his destiny. These things are lost. In a way, that's appropriate. Sargon becomes larger than life precisely because we don't know the mundane details. He becomes a type, an archetype, the self-made king, the empire builder, the man from nowhere who becomes everything. And maybe that's who he was trying to be all along. Maybe the legend of the basket and the river wasn't just propaganda but aspiration. Maybe Sargon looked at the established rulers with their ancient lineages and their inherited thrones and thought, I'll be something different, something new. I won't justify my rule through ancestry. I'll justify it through achievement, through vision, through creating something the world has never seen before. If so, he succeeded beyond measure. As Sargon ages, he prepares for succession. He has sons. The sources mention them, though details are sparse. He's building a dynasty now, not just a personal empire. The challenge is different. He's proven that one exceptional man can conquer the world. Now he has to prove that the empire can outlast him. This is where many empires fail. The founder is extraordinary, driven, capable. But the sons who inherit haven't been tested the same way. They're born to power rather than seizing it. They have different strengths, different weaknesses. The empire that fits the founder like a glove may chafe the successor. Sargon must know this. He's too intelligent not to. So he does what he can to prepare his sons, to set up systems that will function without his direct oversight, to create institutions stronger than any individual. Whether it works remains to be seen. But for now, as Sargon's reign draws toward its close, the world has been transformed. The first empire exists. The template has been created, and nothing will ever be quite the same. Every great historical change is driven by individuals who refuse to accept the world as it is, who look at what everyone else considers impossible and think, why not? Sargon looks at the fragmented, warring Sumerian city-states and thinks, why can't this be unified? Everyone else has tried and failed, or hasn't even tried. But why should that stop me? This is the essence of transformative ambition. Not just wanting more for yourself, but genuinely believing the world can be different and having the audacity to try making it so. Sometimes it fails. Probably it fails more often than it succeeds. History remembers the Sargons, the people who tried and won. But for every Sargon, there are probably dozens of forgotten would-be conquerors who ended up as minor footnotes or didn't make it into the record at all. But when it works, when vision meets opportunity meets ability, the world shifts on its axis, and we're still living with the consequences thousands of years later. Sargon created the empire, and in creating it, he created a new possibility, a new way of organizing human societies on a large scale. Every empire since is, in some sense, an echo of Akkad. Rome, China, the Ottomans, the British, all of them are walking paths that Sargon first carved through the wilderness of human possibility. The foundation has been laid. The empire exists. The man from nowhere has become the true king, the first emperor, standing at the center of a world he remade in his image. Chapter 4. The conquest begins, unifying Mesopotamia. There's a moment in every great undertaking when planning gives way to action, when thoughts become deeds, when the man who's been preparing, studying, waiting, finally steps forward and says, now. For Sargon, that moment comes in the early 23rd century BC, give or take a few years. Dating in this period is imprecise, but the early 2200s BC marks the beginning of something unprecedented. He has his city, Akkad. He has his army. He has his vision. And to the south, Lugal-Zaggisi sits in Uruk, ruling over his confederation of Sumerian cities, powerful, but perhaps not as secure as he appears. The time has come to remake the world. Let's watch it happen, not as a series of dates and names, though we'll mention those when they matter, but as a transformation, as one order collapses and another rises to take its place. War in the ancient world is different from what we might imagine. There are no radios coordinating movements across vast distances, no supply chains managed by computer, no satellite imagery showing enemy positions. Everything depends on direct observation, on messengers running between units, on commanders making decisions with incomplete information. But that doesn't make ancient warfare simple or unsophisticated. Far from it. The generals who succeed in this world are masters of logistics, psychology, timing. They understand terrain. They understand human nature. They know when to fight and when to wait, when to show mercy and when to be ruthless. Sargon is one of these masters. His army, the one that will conquer the known world, is built on an innovation that seems small but changes everything. It's a professional force, a standing army. 5,400 men, according to the sources, who eat at the king's table every day. Think about what this means practically. These aren't farmers who pick up spears when called and go home to their fields when the campaign ends. They're full-time soldiers. This is their job, their identity, their livelihood. They train together constantly. They develop unit cohesion, the trust and understanding that comes from working with the same people day after day. They're loyal to each other and to the man who feeds them, clothes them, gives their lives purpose and meaning. Sargon commands them personally. He's not a king who stays in his palace while others fight his wars. He leads from the front, visible to his men, sharing their hardships, their dangers. It's a powerful bond. The soldiers aren't just following orders. They're following a man they know, a man they've seen face the same risks they face. This army is equipped with bronze weapons. Spears, axes, daggers, bronze helmets for the officers, shields of leather and wood. It's not dramatically different from other armies of the period, but it's well maintained, standardized, reliable. Everyone knows their role. Everyone has trained for this. And crucially, this army can march on short notice. It doesn't need weeks to assemble. It exists. It's ready. This gives Sargon an enormous advantage in mobility and response time. The march south towards Sumer must have been an extraordinary sight. 5,400 men moving in formation, raising dust that can be seen for miles. Support personnel, cooks and servants, and weaponsmiths following behind. Pack animals carrying supplies, tents, spare weapons. They follow the Euphrates, the great river that's been the highway of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. The river provides water, obviously essential in this desert climate. But it also provides orientation. Following the river, you can't get lost. And the cities you're targeting, they're all on or near the river too. It's the spine of civilization, and Sargon is marching down it like an army of fate. News of his approach runs ahead of him. Messengers on fast donkeys carry word from city to city. The king of Akkad is coming. He has an army. He's marching south. In Uruk, Lugal-Zaggisi receives these reports. He has choices to make. Does he meet Sargon in the field, far from the Sumerian heartland, hoping to stop him before he reaches the major cities? Or does he let Sargon come, perhaps hoping the difficulties of campaigning far from home will weaken the Akkadian army? Whatever Lugal-Zaggisi decides, the two armies eventually meet. We don't know exactly where. The sources don't give us a battlefield name, at least not one that survived. But somewhere in central Mesopotamia, probably near one of the major cities, the armies of Akkad and Uruk face each other. Ancient battles are confused, terrifying affairs. There's no general commanding from a safe hilltop, moving units on a map. Once battle is joined, control is limited. You can set your army up in formation. You can give your men their orders. You can lead the initial charge. But after that, it becomes chaos. Small unit actions, individual combats, courage and luck and endurance. Sargon's advantage is discipline. His men have trained together. They know how to maintain formation under pressure. They don't panic and break when the fighting gets hard. They trust their commanders, trust each other, trust the systems they've practiced again and again. Lugal-Zaggisi's army is larger, probably. He's drawing on the manpower of multiple Sumerian cities. But size isn't everything. If your army is a collection of contingents from different cities, each with its own commander, each with its own interests, coordination becomes difficult. Unity of command, unity of purpose, these matter enormously. The battle rages. Men shout, scream, bleed. Bronze weapons clash against bronze shields. The dust raised by thousands of feet obscures vision. The noise is overwhelming. And somewhere, in the midst of it all, commanders try to maintain order, try to direct their men toward advantage, try to recognize the moment when the enemy begins to waver. That moment comes. Perhaps it's a key unit that breaks. Perhaps it's Lugal-Zaghazi himself who's forced to retreat. The sources don't tell us the details. But they tell us the outcome clearly enough. Sargon wins. Decisively. Lugal-Zaghazi is captured. This is crucial. In ancient warfare, capturing the enemy king is the ultimate victory. It's not just about defeating an army. It's about decapitating the entire political structure. With Lugal-Zaghazi in Sargon's hands, his confederation collapses. The cities that followed him because he was strong now have no reason to resist Sargon, who's proven himself stronger. Sargon understands the value of symbols. He doesn't just imprison Lugal-Zaghazi. He humiliates him publicly. The traditional account says Sargon brought him to Nippur, the holy city, the place where Enlil, king of the gods, has his main temple. And there, at the gate of Enlil's temple, Sargon displays Lugal-Zaghazi in a neck stock, a wooden restraint that holds the head immobile. This is theatre. Political theatre of the most calculated kind. Nippur is neutral ground, a religious center rather than a political capital. All the Sumerian cities recognize Nippur's sanctity. By bringing Lugal-Zaghazi there, Sargon is making a statement to all of Sumer. The old order is finished. The man who claimed to rule from sea to sea is now a prisoner, displayed like a trophy. But Sargon does this at Enlil's temple for another reason. He's seeking divine sanction. He's saying, "Look, the gods approve. If they didn't, would I be able to bring my enemy here, to the holiest place in Sumer? The gods have chosen me, just as they once chose Lugal-Zaghazi and now have withdrawn their favor." In a deeply religious society, this matters. People want to believe that power has divine approval, that the universe operates according to some moral order rather than mere chance and force. By linking his victory to the gods, Sargon makes it easier for people to accept his rule. It's not just conquest. It's destiny. With Lugal-Zaghazi defeated, the Sumerian cities face a moment of decision. Each city has to choose, resist this northern conqueror and risk destruction, or submit and hope for favorable terms. Most choose submission. It's the practical choice. What chance do they have individually against an army that's just defeated the combined forces of Lugal-Zaghazi's confederation? But submission doesn't mean they're happy about it, and Sargon knows this. He knows that conquest is just the beginning. The real challenge is holding what you've taken, transforming temporary military dominance into lasting political control. So Sargon makes careful decisions about how to treat the conquered cities. He doesn't destroy them. This is important. He could burn Uruk, raze Ur, turn these ancient centers of civilization into ruins as an example to others. Some conquerors in history take this approach, ruling through terror. Sargon chooses differently. He occupies the cities but leaves them largely intact. The temples continue to function. The priests keep their positions. Mostly, daily life goes on. Trade continues. The fields are still planted and harvested. What changes is governance. Sargon removes the local rulers, the Ensi and Lugal, who've governed these cities for generations. In their place, he installs his own men. Governors loyal to Akkad, loyal to him personally. Men who owe their positions entirely to Sargon, and who can be removed if they prove disloyal or incompetent. This is one of Sargon's key innovations. Centralized, appointed administration replacing hereditary local rulers. It's a system that will be copied by every successful empire that follows. The Persians will use it. Alexander will use it. Rome will use it. The basic principle is sound. Don't leave power in the hands of local dynasties who might develop independent ambitions. Put your own people in charge, people who depend on you for everything. But Sargon is smart enough to know that governance isn't just about control. It's also about legitimacy. People need reasons to accept your rule beyond simple fear. So Sargon adopts Sumerian culture even as he subordinates Sumerian cities. He worships the Sumerian gods, making lavish donations to their temples. He commissions works of art in Sumerian styles. He has inscriptions made in Sumerian as well as Akkadian. He presents himself not as a foreign invader destroying Sumerian civilization, but as the inheritor and protector of that civilization. It's sophisticated, it's calculated, and it works. Over time, the sharp distinction between Akkadian conquerors and Sumerian conquered begins to blur. Akkadians adopt Sumerian cultural practices. Sumerians learn Akkadian and enter the imperial administration. Intermarriage happens. The children of these marriages are what? Akkadian or Sumerian? Both. Neither. Something new. This cultural blending will become one of the enduring legacies of the Akkadian Empire. Sumerian culture doesn't disappear. It merges with Akkadian culture, creating something richer and more complex than either one alone. Let's walk through the process of conquest, city by city, at least the major ones. Because each city has its own character, its own history, its own reasons for submitting or resisting. Uruk, the great city, the home of Lugalzajezi, falls first. With its king captured, resistance collapses quickly. Sargon enters the city, probably through formal ceremony rather than violent assault. He makes offerings at the temple of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, who's long been Uruk's patron deity. He's saying, I respect your traditions. I honor your gods. I'm not here to destroy, but to rule. The people of Uruk, watching this foreign king perform their rituals, speaking their prayers, must have mixed feelings. Relief that the city isn't being sacked. Resentment at foreign occupation. Curiosity about what comes next. Fear. Hope. The full, complex range of human emotion in the face of profound change. The wealthy trading city to the south, submits without a fight. The merchants of are practical people. They calculate that cooperation with Sargon offers more opportunity than resistance. An empire, after all, means larger markets, more security for trade routes, standardized weights and measures across a wide area. These are good for business. So opens its gates and welcomes the conqueror, or at least doesn't actively oppose him. Lagash, the city of meticulous record keepers, the city that's been feuding with for generations over border disputes, also submits. Perhaps the people of Lagash are relieved. Under imperial rule, arbitrary conflicts between neighboring cities become impossible. There's one supreme authority now. It settles disputes. The border with is no longer a matter for armies but for imperial administrators. In a way, it's a kind of peace, even if it's imposed by force. City after city, the pattern repeats. Some resist briefly and are crushed. Most submit and are incorporated into the growing empire. The number given in later sources is 34 cities conquered by Sargon. Whether that's precise or symbolic, it conveys the scope. All of Sumer, all of the Sumerian heartland, comes under Sargon's rule. But Sargon doesn't stop at Sumer. Why would he? The logic of empire is expansion. There are always more lands to conquer, more peoples to incorporate, more resources to control. To the north of Sumer lies the region that will later be called Assyria, though it's not a unified state yet in Sargon's time. It's a collection of cities and towns, less urbanized than Sumer, less wealthy, but strategically important because it controls routes to the mountains where metals and timber can be obtained. Sargon campaigns north. The details are sparse, but the outcome is clear. The northern cities acknowledge his sovereignty. They send tribute to Akkad. They accept Akkadian governors or at least agree not to interfere with Akkadian interests. To the east, toward the Zagros Mountains and the land of Elam, Sargon extends his reach. Elam is an old enemy of Sumer, the source of periodic invasions and raids. But Elam also has resources: timber from mountain forests, stone for building and sculpture, access to trade routes reaching toward the Iranian plateau and beyond. Sargon fights campaigns in Elam, or perhaps negotiates tributary relationships. Again, the sources are frustratingly vague about details, but they're clear about the result. Elam acknowledges Akkadian supremacy, at least during Sargon's lifetime. To the west lies the great prize: Syria, Lebanon, and access to the Mediterranean Sea. This region has cedar forests, the magnificent Lebanon cedars that are essential for large-scale construction. It has trading cities along the coast. It has routes connecting to Anatolia in the north and Egypt in the south. Sargon campaigns west. He crosses the Euphrates, moving into lands that are less familiar, more alien to Mesopotamian sensibilities. The inscriptions claim he reaches the Mediterranean, that he washes his weapons in the upper sea, a ritualistic claim to dominion over everything from sea to sea. Whether Sargon actually establishes direct control over Syrian cities is debatable. More likely, he conducts raids, demonstrates his military power, and establishes tributary relationships. The Syrian cities send gifts, acknowledge his titles, agree not to interfere with trade. This might not be direct governance, but it's certainly influence, and it achieves Sargon's economic goals of controlling access to valuable resources. Let's think about logistics for a moment, because it's easy to say Sargon conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but actually doing it requires solving enormous practical problems. How do you supply an army campaigning hundreds of miles from home? You need food, water, replacement weapons, reinforcements to replace casualties and wounded. In Mesopotamia, you can follow the rivers, rely on riverine transport for heavy goods. But in the Syrian desert or the Zagros Mountains, it's harder. Sargon must have developed sophisticated supply systems. Probably he relied on local resources, taking food from conquered territories. This is hard on the local population, but essential for maintaining an army in the field. Probably he established supply depots at strategic points, places where provisions could be stored and distributed. Probably he used pack animals, donkeys and possibly early camels, to transport supplies across difficult terrain. Communication is another challenge. How does Sargon, when he's campaigning in Syria, stay informed about what's happening in Akkad or Sumer? How does he send orders back to his governors? How does he receive intelligence about potential rebellions or external threats? The answer is messengers, fast riders or runners who carry messages along established routes. It's slow by our standards, days or weeks for a message to travel from one end of the empire to the other. But it's the best available technology, and Sargon makes it work. These practical systems, unglamorous as they are, matter as much as battlefield victories. An army that can't feed itself can't conquer anything. An empire that can't communicate can't govern. Sargon's genius lies not just in winning battles, but in creating the administrative and logistical infrastructure that makes sustained empire possible. There's a human cost to all this. Of course, there always is in war and conquest. Think about the soldiers who die in Sargon's campaigns. Not the enemy, though they matter too, but Sargon's own men. 5,400 soldiers seems like a large standing army for the time, but campaign after campaign takes its toll. Men die in battle. They die from wounds that become infected. They die from disease, probably more than die from combat. They die from accidents, from exhaustion, from exposure in hostile terrain. For every famous conqueror, there are thousands of unnamed soldiers whose bones lie in unmarked graves across the empire. They're the foundation that conquest is built on. Their sacrifices make the emperor's glory possible. And what about the conquered peoples? What about the farmer in Sumer who's required to send a portion of his harvest to Akkad as tribute? What about the merchant in who has to pay new taxes to support an imperial administration he never asked for? What about the family in a Syrian village whose son is conscripted into forced labor, building a road or a fortress for the empire? These costs are real. Empire brings benefits, certainly. Peace, or at least the absence of constant small-scale warfare between cities. Security for trade. Investment in infrastructure. A larger world of possibilities. But it also brings burdens. Taxes. Conscription. Loss of local autonomy. The feeling, however vague, that decisions about your life are being made far away by people who don't know you and don't care about your particular circumstances. This tension between the benefits and costs of empire will persist throughout the Akkadian period and beyond. It's never fully resolved. It can't be. It's inherent in the imperial project itself. By the end of Sargon's conquests, sometime in the mid-23rd century BC, the known world has been transformed. Where there were dozens of independent city-states, there's now an empire. One government. One supreme ruler. One administrative system, or at least the beginning of one. One vision of order imposed across thousands of square miles and hundreds of thousands of people. Sargon takes titles that reflect this achievement: King of Akkad, King of Kish, King of the Land, and most audaciously, King of the Universe. Sharki Shatam in Akkadian, a claim to universal dominion, to rule over everything that matters, everything that exists in the knowable world. It's grandiose, it's unprecedented, and by the standards of the time, it's not entirely unjustified. Sargon has conquered more territory, ruled more people, created a more complex political structure than anyone before him. If that doesn't make him king of the universe, what would? But titles and conquests aren't enough. The real test of empire is durability. Can it last beyond the founder? Can it be passed to the next generation? Can institutions replace individual genius? These are the questions Sargon must face as his reign continues. He's built an empire through force of will and military brilliance. Now he has to transform it into something that can function without him. An old man in Akkad, the city he built, looking out over an empire that didn't exist when he was young. Sargon has done what everyone said was impossible. He's unified the fractured world. He's created order from chaos. He's built something that will echo through the millennia, influencing every empire that comes after. But he must be wondering, in quiet moments, whether all of this will survive him, whether his sons can hold what he's won, whether the empire is strong enough to endure. The world before Sargon and the world after. The transformation is complete, but the story is far from over. Chapter 5. Beyond Mesopotamia, the world's first empire. There's a peculiar psychology to conquest. The first victory makes you hungry for the second. The second makes the third seem inevitable. And before long, you're not asking whether to expand, but only in which direction. Sargon stands at this crossroads in the mid-23rd century BC. Mesopotamia is his. The Sumerian cities pay tribute. His governors administer from Akkad to the Persian Gulf. His army has proven itself superior to anything the region can field against it. He could stop here, consolidate, enjoy what he's won. But empires, once set in motion, develop their own momentum. And Sargon's vision has never been limited to Mesopotamia alone. King of the Universe isn't just a title. It's a program, a statement of intent. So the armies march again. But this time, they're heading into territories fundamentally different from anything they've encountered before. Beyond Mesopotamia lie not civilized city-states, but tribal confederations, mountain kingdoms, trading ports with connections to worlds even Sargon has barely heard of. The empire is about to become truly imperial. Let's start with the north. Above Mesopotamia, the land rises. The flat, alluvial plains give way to rolling hills, then to proper mountains. The Taurus range in what's now Turkey, the Zagros Mountains marching along what will become the border between Iraq and Iran. These are hard lands, difficult lands, nothing like the fertile river valleys Sargon's soldiers know. But these mountains hold wealth, copper mines, silver deposits, forests of timber, precious in a land where wood is scarce. And controlling the mountain passes means controlling the trade routes that connect Mesopotamia to Anatolia, to the regions beyond. Sargon's northern campaigns are different from his conquest of Sumer. There are no great cities to capture, no literate bureaucracies to co-opt. Instead, there are villages, fortified positions, tribal chiefs who command the loyalty of their kinsmen through personal bonds rather than institutional authority. This requires different tactics. You can't appoint a governor to rule over people who don't recognize the concept of centralized administration. You can't demand written tribute agreements from societies that don't use writing. What you can do is make alliances, extract oaths of loyalty, take hostages from important families to ensure good behavior, establish military outposts at strategic locations. The sources tell us that Sargon campaigned in the Cedar Forest and the Silver Mountain. The Cedar Forest is probably Lebanon, that narrow strip of coast where the famous Lebanon cedars grow tall and straight, perfect for roofing temples and palaces. The Silver Mountain is harder to locate, possibly in the Taurus range, possibly further east in the Zagros. These aren't campaigns of total conquest. They're expeditions, demonstrations of force. Sargon marches his army into these regions, defeats any local forces that oppose him, extracts promises of tribute and cooperation, and then withdraws. The goal is to establish Akkadian dominance, to make it clear that resistance is futile and cooperation is profitable, without the expense and difficulty of permanent occupation. It's a sophisticated approach. Sargon understands that direct rule has limits. In some regions, it's simply not practical. Better to create a network of tributary relationships, client states that acknowledge Akkadian supremacy and pay for the privilege of being left largely alone. To the east, the challenge is different again. Elam, the ancient kingdom in southwestern Iran, has been alternating between rivalry and trade with Mesopotamia for centuries. The Elamites have their own cities, their own writing system, their own traditions. They're not barbarians by any definition. They're a civilization in their own right, just different from Mesopotamia. Sargon's relationship with Elam seems to have been complex. There are records of military campaigns, battles fought and won, but there are also records of trade, of diplomatic exchanges, of marriages between Akkadian and Elamite nobility. This makes sense. Elam controls routes to the east, to the Iranian plateau and beyond, to regions that produce lapis lazuli, that magnificent blue stone that Mesopotamian artists prize above almost any other material. Lapis comes from Afghanistan, impossibly far away, but it reaches Mesopotamia through Elamite middlemen. Maintaining good relations with Elam, or at least preventing outright hostility, is essential for keeping these trade networks functioning. So Sargon's policy toward Elam is probably a mixture of intimidation and accommodation. Military campaigns to demonstrate Akkadian power, followed by treaties and trade agreements, the stick and the carrot, force when necessary, commerce when possible. The eastern frontier of the Akkadian Empire remains somewhat fluid throughout Sargon's reign. Elam sometimes acknowledges Akkadian suzerainty, sometimes asserts its independence. It's a pattern that will continue long after Sargon's death, the eastern border expanding and contracting like a living thing, responsive to the strength or weakness of whoever sits on the throne in Akkad. But it's the west that captures the imagination. The west, where the land becomes increasingly arid as you move away from the Euphrates, where nomadic peoples roam with their flocks, where, eventually, you reach the Mediterranean Sea, that vast expanse of water the Mesopotamians call the Upper Sea, mysterious and alluring. Sargon's western campaigns are the stuff of legend, literally. Later sources describe him reaching the Mediterranean, washing his weapons in its waters in a ritual of conquest. They describe him conquering lands as far as the cedar forest and the Silver Mountain. They speak of his control over trade routes reaching to Cyprus, to Crete, to lands whose names the Mesopotamians barely know. How much of this is true? Hard to say. The sources are later, written hundreds of years after Sargon's death, and they have a tendency to exaggerate. But there's probably a core of historical fact beneath the legend. Sargon almost certainly campaigned in Syria. The evidence for this is reasonably solid. Syria is important strategically and economically. It's where Mesopotamian trade routes meet routes coming down from Anatolia and across from Egypt. Control Syria, and you control a crucial nexus of commerce. Syrian cities in this period are smaller than Mesopotamian ones, but they're sophisticated. Places like Ebla, which archaeologists would excavate thousands of years later, finding vast archives of cuneiform tablets. These cities trade with everyone: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Aegean. They're cosmopolitan in a way that even Sumerian cities aren't. Sargon's approach to Syria seems similar to his approach to the northern mountains. Campaign there. Defeat local rulers who resist. Extract tribute and promises of cooperation. Possibly install Akkadian trading agents in key cities, but probably not permanent occupation, not direct rule in the way he rules Sumer. The claim that he reached the Mediterranean is plausible. It's not that far from northern Syria to the coast, and the ritual of washing weapons in the sea is attested in other ancient Near Eastern texts. It's a symbolic act, a way of claiming dominion over everything from one sea to another, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the lower sea to the upper sea, as the inscriptions say. Let's pause and think about what this expansion means in practical terms. What does it take to project power hundreds of miles from your capital? First, you need information. You need to know what's out there. Maps in this period are rudimentary at best. Most geographic knowledge is carried in the minds of merchants and travelers, people who've actually made the journey and can describe the route, the distances, the hazards. Sargon must rely on these sources. Merchants who've traded in Syria, nomads who know the desert routes, captured enemies who can be questioned about their homelands. Slowly, painfully, he pieces together a picture of the wider world and figures out how to navigate it. Second, you need supply lines. We talked about this in the last section, but it's worth emphasizing again. An army marching to Syria is weeks away from Akkad. It needs food, water, replacement equipment. Some of this can be taken from conquered territories, but that's unpredictable and politically costly. Better to establish supply depots, stockpiles of grain and weapons positioned at intervals along the route. Third, you need a reason to be there. Conquest for its own sake is expensive and ultimately unsustainable. But conquest for economic gain, for control of trade routes and resources, that's different. That pays for itself. And this, really, is what drives Sargon's expansion beyond Mesopotamia. It's not megalomania, or not only megalomania. It's a clear-eyed understanding that the wealth of Mesopotamia depends on resources that come from elsewhere. Timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia or Cyprus, tin from even more distant sources, possibly Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, carnelian, exotic woods, precious metals. Control the sources or the routes, and you control wealth. Wealth maintains the army. The army expands the empire. The empire generates more wealth. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, at least as long as it works. There's a moment in Sargon's reign, probably in his later years, when the extent of what he's accomplished becomes clear. Messengers arrive in Akkad from distant lands. Syria, Elam, the northern mountains. They bring tribute, cedar logs, copper ingots, lapis lazuli, silver. They bring news of rebellions suppressed, of trade routes secured, of Akkadian authority acknowledged in places that barely knew Mesopotamia existed a generation ago. Sargon receives these tributes in his palace. Imagine the scene. The Great Hall, probably not as grand as later Mesopotamian palaces, but impressive nonetheless. The king on his throne, now an old man but still commanding, still sharp. His governors and generals arrayed around him. Scribes recording everything in neat cuneiform on clay tablets. The tribute is displayed. The emissaries bow. The scribes note it all. In the year X of Sargon, king of the universe, tribute was received from the land of Y, consisting of Z amount of silver, W logs of cedar, V stones of lapis lazuli. These records serve multiple purposes. They're accounting, obviously. The king needs to know what's coming in, how much, from where, but they're also propaganda. They demonstrate the reach of Akkadian power. They show that the title King of the Universe isn't empty boasting. It's reality. And their insurance. When Sargon dies, his successors will need to know who owes what, where the empire's boundaries are, which regions are directly governed, which are tributaries, which are merely trading partners with no political obligations. These records are the institutional memory that allows the empire to persist beyond its founder. But empire isn't just about kings and tribute and armies. It's about people, ordinary people, whose lives are transformed by forces they barely understand and certainly don't control. Consider a merchant from Ur. Let's call him Ea-Nasir, a good Sumerian name. Ea-Nasir's grandfather traded within Sumer, moving goods between cities, perhaps occasionally venturing down to the Persian Gulf. Profitable work, but limited in scope. Ea-Nasir's world is different. Under the Akkadian Empire, trade routes are secure from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. Standardized weights and measures make transactions simpler. A merchant with an Akkadian seal can travel the length of the empire without constantly renegotiating terms, re-establishing his bona fides, worrying about being robbed at every city gate. Ea-Nasir organizes caravans that go to Syria, bringing back cedar and olive oil. He has partnerships with merchants in Elam, coordinating the lapis trade. He's never been to these places himself, mind you. He's not that adventurous. But he employs agents, men he trusts, who make the journeys and report back. His wealth grows. He builds a larger house in Ur, a proper mansion with a courtyard and rooms for his growing family. He commissions a cylinder seal showing himself in the presence of the gods, a mark of status. He donates to the temple of Nana, ensuring the priests will speak his name in prayers. This is what empire means for people like Ea Nasir. Opportunity. Risk, certainly, but also unprecedented opportunity. The world is larger than it's ever been, and there's profit to be made if you're clever and brave enough to seize it. Or consider a scribe from Lagash, trained in Sumerian cuneiform, proud of his learning. The empire needs administrators, and this scribe is talented. He's offered a position in the imperial bureaucracy, working in one of the governor's offices in Syria. It's a difficult choice. Syria is far from home. He'd be leaving his family, his city, everything familiar. But the pay is good. The prestige is considerable. And there's something exciting about it, if he's honest with himself. The chance to see new places, to be part of something larger than Lagash, to serve not just a city, but an empire. He accepts. He makes the journey. And he finds himself in a Syrian city, working alongside Akkadian officials and local Syrian scribes, all of them using cuneiform, but in different languages, all of them part of this vast administrative machine that Sargon has built. He'll probably never go back to Lagash. He'll marry a Syrian woman, raise children who grow up speaking Akkadian and Syrian Aramaic more fluently than Sumerian. His grandchildren will barely remember that their ancestor came from Lagash. They'll think of themselves as imperials, as Akkadians, their identity tied to the empire rather than to any particular city. This is how empires work at the human level. They move people around. They create new identities. They break down old boundaries and create new ones. And in the process, they transform culture, language, even the way people think about who they are and where they belong. The economy of the Akkadian Empire is more complex than anything the ancient Near East has seen before. It has to be. You can't run an empire this size on the simple redistributive systems that worked for Sumerian city-states. Sargon and his administrators develop new mechanisms. Taxation becomes more systematic. Each region is assessed based on its productive capacity. Agricultural regions pay in grain. Mining regions pay in metals. Coastal regions pay in fish and purple dye. The tribute flows to Akkad, where it's stored in vast warehouses, redistributed to the army, to the bureaucracy, to the temples. Trade is regulated, but encouraged. Merchants who carry Akkadian seals get preferential treatment. Roads are maintained, making travel easier and safer. Banditry is suppressed ruthlessly. The empire becomes, in effect, a vast common market where goods flow more freely than ever before. Standardization helps enormously. Weights and measures are calibrated across the empire. A shekel in Akkad weighs the same as a shekel in Ur or in a Syrian trading post. This seems obvious to us, but it's revolutionary for the time. Previously, every city had its own standards, making trade complicated and prone to disputes. The Akkadian language spreads, not through force, but through utility. If you want to do business across the empire, Akkadian is the language to use. Scribes who know Akkadian have better career prospects. Children of ambitious families learn it alongside whatever their native language is. This linguistic shift will have profound long-term consequences. Akkadian will remain the lingua franca of the Near East for more than 1,500 years, long after the Akkadian Empire itself has fallen. It becomes the language of diplomacy, of scholarship, of international trade. Even the Egyptians and the Hittites will use Akkadian when they correspond with each other. All of this flows from Sargon's conquests, from his creation of an integrated economic and political space spanning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But let's not romanticize empire too much. For every merchant who prospers, there are dozens of farmers who struggle under increased tax burdens. For every scribe who finds opportunity in the imperial bureaucracy, there are craftsmen whose traditional markets are disrupted by cheap goods from distant regions. Empire creates winners and losers. The winners tend to be those with capital, with connections, with the ability to operate on a large scale. The losers tend to be those tied to local economies, those without the resources to compete in larger markets, those whose skills become obsolete as the world changes around them. And then there's the direct cost of empire. The soldiers who die in distant lands, fighting to expand or maintain Sargon's conquests. The young men conscripted for labor, building roads and fortresses, dying from accidents or disease far from home. The rebellions that periodically erupt and must be suppressed, often brutally. The sources mostly don't record these costs. Ancient inscriptions celebrate victories, list tributes, praise the king's wisdom and power. They don't talk about the farmer's son who died of fever in a Syrian camp, the widow struggling to feed her children after her husband was killed, suppressing a rebellion in Elam, the family evicted from their land to make way for an imperial road. These costs are real. They're part of the price of empire, and they're paid disproportionately by people who have the least say in the decisions that create the empire in the first place. By the end of Sargon's reign, the world has been remade. There's an empire now, a real empire, spanning diverse peoples and landscapes, held together by a combination of military force, economic integration, and administrative innovation. It's unprecedented. Nothing like this has existed before, and the very fact of its existence changes how people think about political organization, about the possibilities of human governance. Before Sargon, the city-state was the natural unit of political life. After Sargon, the empire becomes thinkable, imaginable, something to aspire to or to rebel against, but no longer something that can be ignored. The infrastructure Sargon builds, both physical and institutional, will outlast him. The roads, the administrative systems, the trade networks, the linguistic and cultural exchanges. Even when the Akkadian Empire falls, as it will, these foundations will remain, ready to be built upon by whoever comes next. Sargon has created more than an empire. He's created a template, a model, a way of organizing large-scale political life that will be copied, adapted, and refined by empire builders for thousands of years to come. The king of the universe sits in Akkad, now an old man, looking out over a world he's transformed. Messages arrive daily from the far reaches of his empire. Tribute flows in. His governors administer. His armies keep order. The system he's built functions, more or less, with or without his direct involvement. This is the ultimate achievement. Not just conquest, but the creation of institutions that can function beyond the lifespan of their creator. Sargon has built something that might actually last. Chapter 6. The Golden Age. Life under Akkadian rule. Empires exist in the grand narratives of history as lines on maps, as lists of conquered territories, as the achievements of kings. But empires are also lived experiences. They're the daily reality of millions of people who wake up, work, eat, love, argue, dream, and die under imperial rule. What was it actually like to live in the Akkadian Empire at its height? What did the world look like from the perspective of someone who wasn't Sargon, wasn't a general or a governor, but just a person trying to make their way through life? Let's step away from the throne room and the battlefield. Let's walk through the empire as ordinary people experienced it, in the decades after Sargon's conquests, when the initial trauma of conquest has faded and a new normal has established itself. This is the Golden Age. Not necessarily because life is easy, but because the empire is stable, prosperous, functional, because for a brief moment in history, this vast experiment in human organization actually works. Morning in Akkad. The sun rises over the city Sargon built, the city whose location would be lost to history, but which in this moment is the center of the known world. The city is larger than any Sumerian city ever was. Perhaps 80,000 people live within its walls and in the suburbs spreading outside them. 80,000 souls, speaking a dozen languages, worshipping different gods, coming from every corner of the empire and beyond. The streets are already busy by the time the sun clears the horizon. Bakers have been working since before dawn, their ovens radiating heat into the cool morning air. The smell of fresh bread drifts through the neighborhoods, mixing with the less pleasant odors of a city without modern sanitation. Donkeys bray as merchants load them for the day's trading. Children chase each other through the narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off mud brick walls. In the temple district, priests perform the morning rituals. The gods must be fed, clothed, entertained. It's not metaphor. The cult statues literally receive meals, are literally dressed in fine garments, literally have musicians perform for them. The gods are present in their images, and they require service. But these aren't just Akkadian gods. In Akkad, you find temples to Sumerian deities, to Elamite gods, even to the patron deities of distant Syrian cities. The empire is religiously pluralistic, not out of any modern notion of tolerance, but out of pragmatic recognition that you can't rule diverse peoples without accommodating their spiritual needs. So Inanna has a temple here, though Uruk remains her primary home. Enlil is honoured, though Nippur is his true seat. The moon god Nanna, the sun god Shamash, the storm god Adad, all have their places in Akkad's religious landscape. And alongside them are gods whose names would mean nothing to a Sumerian from a century earlier, gods brought by the Elamites and Syrians and mountain peoples who now call Akkad home. Let's follow a particular person through their day. Her name is Ninhagel, a Sumerian name meaning princess of abundance, though she's neither a princess nor particularly abundant in worldly goods. She's a weaver, one of hundreds working in the temple workshops that produce the fine textiles the empire trades across vast distances. Ninhagel is in her 30s, originally from Lagash but living in Akkad for the past 10 years. She came here for work, like so many others. The temple workshops in Akkad are larger than anything in the Sumerian cities, employing hundreds of women, producing cloth at a scale that would have been unimaginable before the empire. She rises with the sun in the small room she rents in a building shared with 24 other workers. The room is barely large enough for a sleeping mat and her few possessions, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak, which is more than many can say. She eats a quick breakfast of barley bread and beer, thin beer, the kind workers drink, more nutritious than intoxicating. Then she walks to the workshop, joining the stream of other women heading in the same direction. The workshop is a large building near one of the temples, with high ceilings to let out the heat and rows of looms where women sit and work. Ninhagel's loom is in a good spot, near a window where natural light helps her see the intricate patterns she's weaving. The work is skilled. She's weaving a piece with geometric patterns, using wool that's been dyed red with madder root and blue with woad. The cloth will be traded, eventually, to Syria, or perhaps even across the sea to Dilmun. Someone she'll never meet will wear it, admire its quality, never knowing the hands that created it. She works steadily, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of years. Around her, other women do the same. They talk as they work, sharing gossip, complaints, news from home. The overseer, a stern Akkadian woman, circulates through the room, checking quality, occasionally criticizing a piece that doesn't meet standards. At midday, there's a break. The women receive their rations, more bread, some onions, occasionally a bit of fish. They eat together in the courtyard, enjoying the brief respite from the close air of the workshop. Ninhagel sits with her friend Ishtar Umi, an Akkadian woman from a village north of the city. They speak in Akkadian, which Ninhagel has learned well enough over the years, though she still sometimes dreams in Sumerian. They talk about ordinary things. Ishtar Umi is worried about her daughter, who's been coughing. Ninhagel mentions that she's saving to buy a better dress for the upcoming festival. Someone saw a merchant from Elam in the market yesterday, selling lapis lazuli at outrageous prices. The overseer's temper has been worse lately, probably because her husband is sick. This is life. Not grand narratives about empire and conquest, but the small concerns of ordinary people. Health and money and relationships and the quality of the bread and whether it will rain. After work, Ninhagel has a few hours before dark. She walks to the market, a vast, sprawling area near the city centre, where merchants from across the empire sell their wares. The market is overwhelming if you're not used to it. Hundreds of stalls and temporary shelters, thousands of people shouting, haggling, displaying goods. The noise is constant, the crowd pressing and jostling. But there's also something exhilarating about it. In the market, you can see the empire made tangible. Here's a merchant selling dates from the far south, near the Persian Gulf. There's a stall with copper ingots from Anatolia. Over there, someone's offering Syrian olive oil, Lebanese cedar boxes, Egyptian linen. Ninhagel stops at a food stall and buys some lentils and onions for her dinner. She splurges on a small piece of dried fish, a rare treat. She considers a pretty bracelet made of carnelian beads, but decides against it. She's saving for that dress. As she walks through the market, she hears a dozen languages. Akkadian, obviously. Sumerian, Elamite, Syrian dialects, languages she can't even identify, from the mountains or from across the sea. And yet somehow it all works. Merchants and buyers find ways to communicate through gesture and broken phrases and the universal language of commerce. This linguistic diversity is one of the empire's defining features. Unlike later empires that will try to impose a single language, the Akkadian Empire is fundamentally multilingual. Akkadian is the administrative language, the language of power and prestige. But Sumerian remains important, especially for religious and scholarly purposes. And local languages persist everywhere, in homes and markets and villages. The empire is creating something new, people who are fluent in multiple languages, who switch between them depending on context. Nin Hegal speaks Sumerian at home when she writes letters to her family in Lagash. She speaks Akkadian at work and in most public settings. She knows a smattering of Elamite from friends. This multilingualism will become characteristic of the cosmopolitan cities of the ancient Near East. Evening falls. Nin Hegal returns to her room, cooks her simple dinner over a small brazier, eats while sitting on her mat. Through the thin walls, she can hear her neighbors, a family arguing, children crying, someone singing. She thinks about her life. 10 years in Akkad. 10 years since she left Lagash, left her family, came to the capital seeking work and adventure. Has it been worth it? In some ways, yes. She earns more here than she could have in Lagash. She's seen things, experienced things. The great temples of Akkad, the incredible diversity of the markets, festivals and processions. Once, she even saw the king, Sargon himself, old by then but still impressive, riding through the streets with his guard. But she's also lonely sometimes. Lagash is only a week's journey away, but she rarely has the time or money to visit. She's made friends in Akkad, but it's not the same as family. She wonders if she'll ever marry, have children. At her age, prospects are dimming. These are the calculations people make under empire. The opportunities it offers versus the costs it extracts. For Nin Hegel, the balance has been acceptable, more or less. But she knows others who've fared worse. A woman from her workshop who got sick and couldn't work, who lost her room and ended up begging in the streets. A merchant who invested everything in a trading venture that failed, who hanged himself in despair. Empire creates possibilities, but it doesn't guarantee outcomes. And for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, women without family wealth or connections, the margin for error is thin. Let's shift perspective. Let's look at life from a very different vantage point. Ilshu Rabi is a merchant, a successful one. His family has been in trade for 3 generations, originally based in but now with operations spanning the empire. His grandfather traded within Sumer. His father expanded to Elam and the northern cities. Ilshu Rabi himself trades from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He's in his 40s, wealthy enough to own a substantial house in Akkad's merchant quarter, wealthy enough to maintain households in 3 other cities. He has a wife and concubines, numerous children, servants, scribes, who manage his accounts. Today, he's concluding a major deal. He's been negotiating for weeks with a consortium of Syrian merchants to establish a regular trade route bringing cedar and olive oil to Mesopotamia in exchange for textiles and metalwork. The margins are thin, the risks substantial, but if it works, it could generate enormous profits. The meeting takes place in his house, in a room set aside for business. The Syrian merchants arrive with their translator, a scribe who speaks both Akkadian and Syrian Aramaic fluently. Wine is served, imported wine from the Syrian hills, expensive but necessary for establishing the right atmosphere. They haggle over details, quantities, prices, transportation costs. Who bears the risk if a caravan is lost? How disputes will be resolved? Everything is negotiated carefully, with both sides probing for advantage while trying to maintain the relationship. Finally, they reach agreement. Ilshu Rabi's scribe records the terms on a clay tablet in Akkadian. The Syrian scribe makes his own record in Aramaic. Both copies are sealed with the parties' cylinder seals, rolling the carved stone across the wet clay to leave distinctive impressions. These sealed tablets are legal documents, enforceable in the empire's courts. This is how the empire functions at the elite level. Networks of merchants and officials connected across vast distances, creating relationships that bind the empire together more effectively than any army could. These men speak different languages, worship different gods, come from different cultures, but they share a common interest in the empire's stability and prosperity. Il-Shurabi sees himself as Akkadian, even though his family is Sumerian. He's invested in the empire. His wealth depends on it. His children will grow up speaking Akkadian as their primary language, marrying into Akkadian families, thinking of themselves as imperials rather than as Sumerians. This transformation of identity is happening across the empire. People are becoming Akkadian, not through force but through self-interest and cultural pressure, and the simple fact that children grow up in a world where the empire is normal, natural, the only system they've ever known. Let's look at religion more closely, because religion isn't just about individual belief. It's one of the primary ways the empire creates unity out of diversity. The Akkadian approach to religion is syncretistic. They don't try to suppress local gods or impose Akkadian deities on conquered peoples. Instead, they incorporate everything into an increasingly complex pantheon where gods are identified with each other, where the Akkadian name for a god and the Sumerian name are understood as referring to the same divine being. So, Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, becomes identified with Ishtar, her Akkadian equivalent. Enlil, the Sumerian king of the gods, is Elil in Akkadian. The moon god is Nana in Sumerian, Sin in Akkadian. Same god, different names, depending on which language you're speaking. This flexibility allows the empire to maintain religious cohesion without alienating local populations. A Sumerian can worship Inanna in Sumerian, an Akkadian can worship Ishtar in Akkadian, and they're both understood to be honoring the same goddess. Temples receive imperial patronage. Sargon and his successors make lavish donations to temples across the empire, not just in Akkad, but in the old Sumerian cities, in Syrian temples, in Elamite shrines. This serves multiple purposes. It legitimizes their rule by showing piety toward all the gods. It creates gratitude among the priestly classes, whose support is politically valuable. And it circulates wealth through the economy, since temples are major employers and consumers. The religious calendar becomes more complex and cosmopolitan. Festivals that were once local to particular cities are now celebrated empire-wide. Merchants time their trading ventures around these festivals. Officials schedule administrative tasks around them. The shared religious calendar creates temporal unity across vast distances. Education is expanding under the empire, though it remains limited to a small elite. But that elite is larger than it used to be, and more diverse. Scribal schools exist in all the major cities. They teach cuneiform writing, mathematics, literature, law. The curriculum is demanding. Students spend years learning to read and write, memorizing thousands of cuneiform signs, practicing on clay tablets that can be smoothed and reused. The language of instruction is increasingly Akkadian, though Sumerian remains important as a scholarly language. It's becoming what Latin will be in medieval Europe, a language of learning and religion, spoken by the educated, but not by ordinary people. Students come from all over the empire. The son of a Syrian merchant studies alongside the son of a Sumerian priest and the son of an Akkadian official. They learn the same texts, perform the same exercises, compete for the same positions in the imperial bureaucracy. These schools are creating a class of imperial administrators, people whose primary loyalty is to the empire rather than to any particular city or ethnicity. They're taught to think in imperial terms, to see the empire as a unified whole rather than as a collection of conquered territories. This is crucial for the empire's long-term stability. Armies can conquer, but only institutions can rule. And institutions depend on people, trained people, people who know how to administer, how to keep records, how to collect taxes and settle disputes and maintain order. Let's talk about law, because law is one of the ways empires create unity. The Akkadian Empire doesn't have a unified law code, not in the way later empires will, but it does have standardized legal procedures. Courts function similarly across the empire. Evidence is evaluated according to consistent principles. Punishments for similar crimes are roughly comparable. Local customs are respected, mostly. If a dispute involves only locals and concerns local matters, local law applies. But if the dispute crosses regional boundaries, If it involves imperial officials, if it concerns matters that affect the empire as a whole, then imperial courts take jurisdiction. These imperial courts are staffed by trained judges, often men who've studied at the scribal schools. They keep detailed records of their decisions, creating a body of precedent that future judges can consult. Over time, this creates consistency, a sense that justice under the empire is predictable and fair, or at least fairer than the arbitrary rule of local strongmen. Of course, wealth matters. It always does. A rich merchant with good lawyers has advantages that a poor farmer doesn't. But the existence of formal legal procedures, of courts where disputes can be settled without violence, this is progress of a sort. People begin to trust the system, or at least to use it. Records from this period show thousands of lawsuits, property disputes, contract disagreements, inheritance fights, accusations of theft or fraud. The fact that people bring these disputes to court rather than settling them through violence or vendetta suggests that the legal system is functional, that it provides value. Infrastructure is one of the empire's most tangible achievements. Roads, maintained and patrolled, connect the major cities. Way stations provide water and food for travelers. Bridges cross rivers. Canals, originally built for irrigation, are expanded and improved to facilitate transportation. This infrastructure makes trade easier, obviously, but it also makes communication faster. Messages can travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months. Provincial governors can report to the capital, receive instructions, coordinate responses to crises. The roads are also military assets. Armies can move quickly along them, responding to rebellions or external threats. The empire's ability to project power depends on these roads, on the capacity to get soldiers where they're needed before a local problem becomes an existential crisis. Ordinary people benefit too. A farmer in a remote village now has access to markets that were previously unreachable. He can sell his surplus grain in a city a week's journey away, buying goods that his village can't produce. The empire expands economic possibilities, creating wealth that, while distributed unevenly, does trickle down to some extent. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. Life under the Akkadian Empire is hard for most people. Infant mortality is high. Disease is common and often fatal. Agricultural work is backbreaking. The average person lives in poverty by any modern standard, in a one-room mud brick house, eating a monotonous diet, wearing simple clothes, working from dawn to dusk. The empire demands taxes, both in kind and in labor. Farmers must give a portion of their harvest to the state. Young men are conscripted for military service or forced labor on imperial projects. These burdens are real and sometimes crushing, and there's always the threat of violence. Rebellions, when they occur, are suppressed brutally. The empire makes examples of rebels, executing leaders, destroying rebellious cities, enslaving populations. This violence serves a purpose. It deters future rebellion. But it's also traumatic, devastating for the people who experience it. Women have limited rights. They can own property, engage in trade, bring lawsuits, but they're subordinate to fathers and husbands in most matters. Marriage is often arranged. Divorce is possible but difficult. Women of wealthy families have more autonomy than poor women, but even they live within strict social constraints. Slavery exists, though it's not as central to the economy as it will be in later civilizations like Greece or Rome. Slaves are usually war captives or people who've fallen into debt. They have few rights and can be bought, sold, or inherited like property. Some slaves have specialized skills and live relatively well. Most don't. And yet, despite all these hardships, there's something remarkable happening. A sense of possibility, of participation in something larger than any individual life. A scribe from Lagash works in Syria and corresponds with colleagues in Elam. A merchant's daughter in Akkad marries a Syrian trader and moves to a coastal city, where she'll raise children who speak 3 languages fluently. A soldier from a mountain village serves in the imperial army, sees the great cities of Mesopotamia, retires with a land grant in a territory he'd never heard of as a child. The empire is mixing peoples, spreading ideas, creating connections that transcend traditional boundaries. It's not always voluntary. It's not always pleasant, but it's transformative. Art is flourishing. Akkadian sculptors are creating works of unprecedented realism and emotional power. The famous bronze head, possibly depicting Sargon himself, shows a level of craftsmanship that rivals anything produced in the ancient world. Cylinder seals reach new heights of intricacy, tiny carved stones that tell complex stories in miniature. Literature is developing. Scribes are composing hymns, myths, chronicles. Some of these texts will be copied and recopied for thousands of years, becoming classics of ancient Near Eastern literature. The story of Gilgamesh, which predates the empire, is being elaborated and refined. New stories are being created, celebrating the deeds of Sargon and his successors. This is the Golden Age. Not because everyone is prosperous or happy, but because the empire is functioning, creating space for human creativity and ambition, connecting distant peoples, building institutions that will outlast any individual ruler. It won't last forever. Nothing does. But for now, in these decades after Sargon's conquests, the Akkadian Empire is vibrant, dynamic, alive with possibility. The sun sets over Akkad. Ninhegel lies down to sleep in her small room. Ilshurabi reviews his accounts by lamplight. A priest chants evening prayers in a temple. A soldier stands guard on the city walls. A child cries. A couple makes love. Life, in all its mundane complexity, continues under the empire's wide shadow. Chapter 7. Dynasty and Succession after Sargon. Every empire faces its ultimate test when the founder dies. The man who built the system through force of personality, who commanded loyalty through personal charisma and proven success, is gone. What remains? Can institutions outlive their creator? Can sons inherit not just a throne but the qualities that made their father great? For the Akkadian Empire, this test comes sometime in the late 23rd century BC. Sargon, the man who conquered the known world, who unified Mesopotamia for the first time, who styled himself king of the universe, dies after ruling for 56 years. He's lived long enough to see his empire stabilize, to watch the systems he created take root and function. But he's also lived long enough to know that succession is never guaranteed, that the transition of power is the moment when empires are most vulnerable. What happens next will determine whether the Akkadian Empire was just one man's achievement or something more enduring. Sargon has prepared for this moment as much as any ruler can. He has sons, men he's trained and tested, who've served as governors and generals, who understand the empire from the inside. The succession should be orderly, but should be and is are different things. His immediate successor is Rimush, one of his sons. The sources are somewhat confusing about the exact family relationships, later texts contradicting each other on details. But what's clear is that Rimush inherits the throne and immediately faces the challenge every new ruler faces, proving he deserves it. The empire's subject peoples have submitted to Sargon. They've paid tribute, acknowledged his supremacy, accepted his governors, but they submitted to Sargon personally, to a man whose military genius and political acumen were proven beyond doubt. His son is untested. The question hangs in the air. Will the empire hold together under new leadership? The answer, at first, is no. Rebellions break out across the empire. The sources tell us about uprisings in Sumer, in Elam, in the northern territories. It's as if Sargon's death is a signal, a moment of opportunity for those who've chafed under Akkadian rule. This isn't surprising. It's almost inevitable. Ancient empires depend heavily on personal authority, on the prestige and fear associated with a particular ruler. When that ruler dies, his successor must re-establish dominance, must prove that the empire's power transcends any individual. Rimush proves it the hard way, through war. The inscriptions left by Rimush are remarkable documents, detailed accounts of military campaigns that read like after-action reports. They give numbers, names, specific details about battles and casualties. One inscription describes a battle in Sumer where Rimush claims to have killed 8,400 men and taken another 5,800 as captives. Whether these numbers are accurate or exaggerated, the scale is significant. This isn't a minor skirmish. This is a major military operation, an army of thousands fielded to suppress rebellion. The inscription goes on to describe how Rimush captured the cities of Ur, Umma, Adab, Lagash. These are the great Sumerian cities, the same cities Sargon conquered decades earlier. They've risen in rebellion, probably coordinating their efforts, betting that Rimush is weaker than his father. They're wrong. Rimush defeats them systematically. He destroys their armies. He captures their leaders. And then, crucially, he makes examples of them. The inscriptions describe executions, enslavements, the razing of city walls. It's brutal, but it's calculated brutality. Rimush is sending a message to the entire empire. Rebellion will not be tolerated. The Akkadian Empire did not die with Sargon. Similar campaigns are fought in Elam. The Elamites, who had acknowledged Sargon's supremacy reluctantly, see his death as an opportunity to reassert independence. Rimush marches east, fights a series of battles, defeats the Elamite armies, and re-establishes Akkadian dominance. The pattern is consistent. Rebellion, suppression, harsh punishment. Within a few years, Rimush has put down all the major uprisings and re-established imperial control. But at what cost? Let's think about what these rebellions mean for ordinary people. For someone like Nin Hegel, the weaver we met in the last section, or for a farmer in one of the Sumerian cities. When rebellion breaks out, daily life becomes terrifyingly uncertain. Armies march. Trade stops. Food supplies become unreliable. If you're in a city that's rebelling, you're gambling that the rebellion will succeed, because if it doesn't, the consequences will be severe. Imagine being a farmer outside Ur when the city rises in rebellion. You didn't choose this. You weren't consulted. But now you're caught up in it. The rebel leaders are demanding provisions for their army. Imperial forces are approaching. Your fields lie between the two forces. You and your family huddle in your house, listening to the sounds of battle in the distance, praying to survive whatever comes next. The battle ends. The Imperials win. Soldiers sweep through the countryside, looking for rebels, for anyone who aided the rebellion. Are you guilty? You gave food to the rebel army, but you had no choice. Will the Imperial soldiers care about that? Some farmers are executed as examples. Others are enslaved. The lucky ones are allowed to live and work their fields, but with increased tax burdens to compensate for the costs of suppressing the rebellion. This is the reality of succession crises in ancient empires. The powerful play their games of thrones and conquest. The powerless suffer the consequences. Rimush rules for about 9 years. The sources suggest he dies violently, possibly assassinated, though the details are unclear. Palace intrigue, perhaps? A conspiracy among his own officials? Or maybe a foreign enemy? Ancient rulership is dangerous. Kings die in battle, from disease, from assassination. The mortality rate among rulers is high, and when a king dies suddenly, especially violently, it triggers another succession crisis. After Rimush comes Manishtushu, identified as either Rimush's brother or possibly his son. Again, the sources are confusing. Family relationships in this period are hard to establish with certainty. But what matters is that Manishtushu takes the throne and faces his own set of challenges. Manishtushu seems to have taken a different approach than Rimush. Where Rimush focused on suppressing rebellions in the imperial heartland, Manishtushu looks outward, launching ambitious campaigns across the Persian Gulf. The inscriptions describe expeditions to Dilmun, Magan, and other lands along the Gulf Coast, and possibly as far as the Indus Valley. These aren't purely military campaigns. They're commercial expeditions, attempts to establish direct control over the trade routes that bring precious resources to Mesopotamia. Copper from Magan, timber and precious stones from Dilmun, possibly luxury goods from even more distant lands. Manishtushu wants to cut out the middlemen to establish Akkadian dominance over these trade networks. It's an ambitious vision. If it works, it could make the empire fantastically wealthy. But it's also risky, stretching Akkadian resources to cover territories far from the imperial heartland. The sources suggest mixed results. Manishtushu establishes some degree of Akkadian presence along the Gulf, but whether this translates into lasting control is questionable. Maritime trade is different from land-based conquest. You can't appoint a governor to rule over shipping lanes. You can't build fortresses in the middle of the ocean. Manishtushu rules for about 15 years before he too dies, possibly violently. The sources mention palace conspiracies, hints of internal conflict. By now, a pattern is emerging. Akkadian kings rule for a decade or two, then die, often under suspicious circumstances. Each death triggers instability, rebellions, succession, struggles. This is the weakness of dynastic systems. Everything depends on the smooth transfer of power from one generation to the next. And smooth transfers are rare. There are always factions, rivals, ambitious nobles who see a succession as an opportunity to advance their interests. But despite these recurring crises, the empire survives. The institutions Sargon created are strong enough to weather the storms. The administrative systems continue to function. The governors, many of them appointed decades earlier, remain in their positions. The army, loyal to the throne if not always to the specific person sitting on it, maintains order. This is Sargon's real achievement. Not just conquest, but institutional durability. He built something that could survive imperfect successors, that could endure through periods of instability. After Manishtushu comes the ruler who will take the empire to its greatest height, Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon. Naram-Sin is different from his predecessors. Where Sargon was a revolutionary, creating something new, and where Rimush and Manishtushu were consolidators, struggling to maintain what Sargon built, Naram-Sin is an emperor in the fullest sense. Confident, ambitious, willing to push boundaries. He rules for about 37 years, longer than anyone since Sargon himself. And during that time, he transforms the empire in fundamental ways. First, he expands it. Naram-Sin campaigns north into the mountains, defeating the Lullaby people and establishing Akkadian control over territories that even Sargon hadn't fully subdued. He campaigns west into Syria, east into Elam. The empire under Naram-Sin reaches its greatest territorial extent. But more significant than territorial expansion is how Naram-Sin presents himself. He takes the ultimate step that Sargon never quite took. He declares himself divine. This is unprecedented in Mesopotamian tradition. Kings are supposed to be chosen by the gods, to rule with divine approval. But they're still human, still mortal, still subject to the gods' will. Naram-Sin changes this. He adds the divine determinative to his name in inscriptions, a sign used only for gods. He calls himself God of Akkad. He has temples built to himself, receives worship like a deity. It's a bold move, and it reveals something about how the empire has evolved. Sargon built an empire by being exceptional, by demonstrating abilities that set him apart from ordinary rulers. But how do you institutionalize exceptionalism? How do you make your successors seem worthy of the power they inherit? One answer is divinity. If the king isn't just a talented human but a god, then his authority is absolute and unquestionable. It doesn't matter if he's personally less impressive than his grandfather. He's a god. That's all that matters. Naram-Sin's most famous monument is the Victory Stele, a carved stone relief commemorating his victory over the Lullaby. It's a masterpiece of ancient art, and it tells us a lot about how Naram-Sin wanted to be remembered. The stele shows Naram-Sin larger than life, climbing a mountain, trampling his enemies underfoot. He wears a horned crown, a symbol of divinity. Above him are stars representing the gods, but they're smaller than he is, suggesting that Naram-Sin is equal to or greater than the traditional deities. His soldiers follow behind him, also climbing the mountain, but they're smaller, emphasizing Naram-Sin's superiority. The enemy Lullaby are shown defeated, broken, begging for mercy. Everything about the composition emphasizes Naram-Sin's power, his divine status, his absolute dominance over both his subjects and his enemies. It's propaganda, obviously, but it's effective propaganda. Anyone who saw this stele would understand the message. Naram-Sin is not to be challenged. The stele was originally set up in Sippar, one of the Sumerian cities. But centuries later, it would be taken as war booty by the Elamites and transported to Susa, where archaeologists would eventually discover it. The fact that it survived, that we can still see it today in a museum, is a testament to its artistic quality and historical significance. But divinity is a double-edged sword. If you claim to be a god, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because gods are supposed to be all-powerful, and if something goes wrong, if the empire faces setbacks, people will question your divinity. And things do go wrong. Late in Naram-Sin's reign, the empire faces a serious crisis. A people called the Gutians, mountain tribes from the Zagros range, begin raiding into Mesopotamia. At first, these are probably just small-scale incursions, the kind of thing the empire has dealt with before. But the Gutian threat grows. The sources are frustratingly vague, but they suggest that Naram-Sin struggles to contain them. There may have been a major defeat, though the details are lost. What we know is that by the end of Naram-Sin's reign, the Gutians are a serious problem, one that his successors will inherit. There's also evidence of internal problems. Rebellions, always a challenge for Akkadian rulers, seem to intensify. The sources mention destroyed cities, harsh repressions. The empire is showing strain. Climate change may be playing a role. Some archaeological and geological evidence suggests that the late 23rd century BC saw a period of increased aridity in the Near East. Droughts would have devastated agriculture, leading to food shortages, economic stress, social unrest. An empire built on agricultural surplus becomes vulnerable when the rains fail. We have to be careful about environmental determinism. Climate change doesn't cause empires to fall directly, but it can create stresses that exacerbate existing problems, that turn manageable challenges into crises. Let's step back and assess the dynasty as a whole, from Sargon through Naram-Sin. In some ways, the succession has been successful. The empire has survived 4 rulers over roughly a century. It's expanded its territory. It's maintained administrative control over vast, diverse regions. The Akkadian language has spread. Trade networks have grown. Cultural exchange has flourished. But there are also weaknesses. The recurring rebellions suggest that the empire hasn't fully solved the problem of legitimacy. Conquered peoples submit when forced to, but rebel when they see opportunity. The loyalty is to power, not to any sense of shared imperial identity. The violent deaths of multiple rulers suggest instability at the center. Palace politics are dangerous. Factions compete for influence. The succession is never quite secure. And the reliance on personal authority, even when dressed up as divinity, means the empire is vulnerable to having a weak ruler. So far, they've been lucky. Rimush, Manishtushu, and Naram-Sin were all capable, if not quite at Sargon's level. But what happens when someone incompetent inherits the throne? That question will be answered soon enough. There's something poignant about dynasties. Their attempts to cheat time, to make personal achievement hereditary, to transform individual greatness into permanent institutional power. Sometimes it works, for a while. Sometimes a dynasty lasts for centuries, adapting to changing circumstances, finding capable rulers in each generation. But more often, dynasties decline. The founder's grandchildren lack his hunger, his drive. They're born to power and don't appreciate what it took to create it. They make mistakes, trust the wrong advisors, fail to recognize when the world is changing. The Akkadian dynasty is entering this phase. Naram-Sin, for all his achievements, is the last truly capable ruler. After him comes his son Shah-Kali-Shari, whose very name is telling, King of all kings. It's a desperate assertion of authority, as if saying it loudly enough will make it true. Shah-Kali-Shari inherits an empire under stress. The Gutians are a growing threat. Other enemies press at the borders. Internal rebellions continue. The climate may be turning against agriculture, and the administrative systems, built for stability, are showing their age. He rules for about 25 years, fighting constantly, struggling to hold together what his predecessors built. The sources portray him as competent, energetic, doing his best, but his best isn't quite enough. After Shah-Kali-Shari, the record becomes confused. There are kings with short reigns, some lasting only a year or two. Usurpers, perhaps. Rival claimants. The sources can't agree on names or sequence. It's the chaos that typically marks the end of a dynasty. The empire is fracturing. Governors in distant regions stop sending tribute, start acting independently. The Sumerian cities reassert autonomy. The Gutians push deeper into Mesopotamia. The center cannot hold. Within a generation of Shah Kali-Shari's death, the Akkadian Empire effectively ceases to exist as a unified political entity. The dynasty that Sargon founded, that ruled for roughly a century and a half, comes to an end. But the story isn't quite over. Because even in collapse, the Akkadian Empire leaves a legacy that will shape Mesopotamian history for thousands of years to come. Chapter 8. The cracks appear seeds of decline. There's rarely a single moment when an empire falls. Instead, there are accumulating stresses, small failures that compound into larger ones, cracks in the foundation that widen slowly until one day the whole structure collapses. The Akkadian Empire's decline follows this pattern. From the outside, during Naram-Sin's later years and into the reign of Shah Kali-Shari, the empire still looks formidable. Armies still march. Tribute still arrives, if less reliably. The administrative machinery still functions, if less smoothly. But beneath the surface, the signs of decay are multiplying. Let's trace these cracks as they form, understanding that what we're watching is a process, not an event. A slow unraveling of the systems that held the world's first empire together. The first and most visible problem is military. The Gutians, those mountain tribes from the Zagros range, are becoming more than just raiders. They're becoming an existential threat. Who exactly are the Gutians? The sources treat them almost as forces of nature rather than as a people with their own history and motivations. They're described as barbarians, uncivilized, destructive. This probably tells us more about Mesopotamian prejudices than about the Gutians themselves. What we can reasonably infer is that the Gutians are highland peoples, tribal rather than urban, pastoral rather than agricultural. They live in the mountains east of Mesopotamia, in territory that's difficult for lowland armies to penetrate. They're tough, mobile, accustomed to harsh conditions. For decades, the Akkadian Empire has kept them at bay through a combination of military expeditions into the mountains and fortified frontier posts. But something changes in the late 23rd century BC. The Gutian raids become more frequent, more aggressive, more organized. Part of this may be push factors in the highlands, climate change affecting their pastoral lands, population pressure, political consolidation creating larger, more capable Gutian confederations. We don't know the specifics, but something is driving them toward Mesopotamia with increasing urgency, and the empire is less capable of responding than it used to be. The army is stretched thin. Decades of campaigning have taken their toll. The standing army that was Sargon's innovation has grown expensive to maintain, especially as agricultural revenues decline due to drought and mismanagement. Shah Kali-Shari fights the Gutians repeatedly. The inscriptions record victories, but the fact that he has to keep fighting suggests the victories aren't decisive. The Gutians retreat into the mountains after each defeat, then return a few years later. It's a war of attrition, and the empire is losing, not in any single battle, but cumulatively, as resources are drained fighting an enemy that can't be permanently defeated using conventional imperial methods. The second problem is environmental, though it takes time for people to recognize it as such. The climate in the late 3rd millennium BC is changing. The evidence comes from multiple sources: geological cores showing changes in rainfall patterns, archaeological evidence of abandoned agricultural settlements, ancient texts mentioning drought and famine. The change isn't dramatic by our standards. We're talking about a shift from relatively wet conditions to somewhat drier ones, a reduction in average rainfall of maybe 10 or 15%. But in an agricultural system that operates close to the margin, that's enough to cause serious problems. Irrigation agriculture, the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization, is particularly vulnerable. It depends on predictable river flows, on annual flooding that replenishes the soil. When rainfall decreases, river levels drop. Canals that once carried water reliably run dry. Fields that were productive become marginal or fail entirely. And there's a feedback loop. When irrigation systems aren't maintained properly, when canals silt up or break down, the problem gets worse. Areas that could still be farmed with good water management are abandoned instead. Agricultural production drops faster than the climate change alone would predict. Why aren't the irrigation systems maintained? Partly because of the political instability. When the empire is fighting constant wars, when labor is being conscripted for military service, There aren't enough people to do the routine maintenance that irrigation requires, partly because of administrative breakdown. The centralized system that once coordinated canal maintenance across wide areas is fragmenting. The result is a food crisis. Not everywhere, not all at once, but spreading through the empire. Harvests decline. Grain storage runs low. Prices rise. People go hungry. Hungry people are desperate people. And desperate people rebel, migrate, turn to banditry, anything to survive. The social order begins to break down. The third problem is economic, closely related to the environmental crisis but with its own dynamics. The Akkadian Empire's economy depends on long-distance trade. We saw this in earlier sections. The merchants moving goods from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, the trade networks that bring copper and tin and lapis lazuli to Mesopotamia. This trade generates wealth, and that wealth supports the empire. But trade requires security. Merchants need to trust that caravans won't be robbed, that contracts will be enforced, that the routes are safe. When the empire can no longer provide that security, trade declines. And the empire can't provide security anymore. The roads that were once patrolled are now dangerous. Bandits, possibly including Gutian raiders, attack caravans. Merchants who once moved freely across the empire now hire armed escorts, driving up costs. Some trade routes are abandoned entirely as too risky. The decline in trade creates a vicious cycle. Less trade means less revenue for the imperial government. Less revenue means the army and administration can't be maintained properly. A weaker army and administration means less security. Less security means even less trade. The great markets that once characterized imperial cities are shrinking. Exotic goods become rare and expensive. Merchants who built fortunes in the empire's heyday see their businesses collapse. The cosmopolitan world we glimpsed in earlier sections is contracting, becoming more local, more provincial. For someone like Il-Shurabi, the merchant we met earlier, these are catastrophic times. His trading network, which once spanned from Elam to Syria, is falling apart. Routes he's used for decades are no longer safe. Business partners in distant cities stop responding to messages. Ventures that should be profitable fail because goods never arrive. He's wealthy enough to weather some losses, but the trend is ominous. His sons, who are supposed to inherit and expand the business, are instead scrambling to salvage what they can. The future that seemed so bright a generation ago is dimming. The fourth problem is political, a crisis of legitimacy that has been building since Sargon's death. The empire was built on Sargon's personal authority. He conquered through military genius and held the empire together through institutional innovation and political skill. His immediate successors maintained the system largely through force, suppressing rebellions, demonstrating that Akkadian power survived Sargon's death. Naram-Sin tried to solve the legitimacy problem by claiming divinity. If the king is a god, then his authority is absolute and unquestionable. But divinity cuts both ways. When things go well, it reinforces authority. When things go badly, it undermines it. A god-king shouldn't be losing wars or presiding over famine. By Shah Kali Shari's reign, the claim of divinity rings hollow. He's clearly not all-powerful. He can't defeat the Gutians decisively. He can't make the rains come. He can't restore the prosperity of his grandfather's time. And if he's not really divine, then what's his claim to rule? Just inheritance, being the son of the previous king. But inheritance alone isn't enough when the empire is failing. People start asking, if the dynasty can't protect us, can't provide order and prosperity, why should we obey it? Local strongmen in various regions begin asserting independence. They stop sending tribute to Akkad. They stop acknowledging the king's authority. They start calling themselves king, ruling their territories as autonomous domains. The empire is fragmenting politically, reverting to something like the city-state system that existed before Sargon. But it's messier now, more violent, because the imperial structures are still partially in place, creating conflict over who has authority to do what. Governors appointed by Akkad compete with local rulers who claim traditional authority. Rival claimants to the throne emerge in different cities. Civil war, or something close to it, breaks out in several regions. Let's look at what this collapse feels like for ordinary people. For Nin Hegel, the weaver, life becomes progressively harder. The workshop where she's worked for years starts receiving fewer orders. The international trade that once consumed vast quantities of textiles is drying up. The workshop reduces its workforce. Nin Hegel, as one of the more junior workers, is let go. She tries to find other work, but jobs are scarce. Too many people competing for too few positions. She takes whatever she can get: day labor, temporary positions, anything to survive. Her savings run out. She can't afford her room anymore. She moves to cheaper accommodations, a corner of a shared room in a worse part of the city. The neighborhood is dangerous. Crime is rising as social order breaks down. She thinks about going home to Lagash, but she hears it's not much better there. The whole empire is suffering. There's no escape by moving from one city to another. She's hungry much of the time now. The bread is coarser, adulterated with cheaper grains. Sometimes there's no bread at all. The beer she once took for granted is now a luxury she can't afford. She sees the wealthy still living well, still eating good food, still wearing fine clothes. The crisis isn't affecting everyone equally. Those with resources can weather the storm. Those without, like Nin Hegel, suffer. There's anger in this inequality, a sense of injustice. Why should she starve while merchants and nobles feast? The social contract that holds civilizations together is fraying. In the countryside, the situation is even worse in some ways. A farmer whose family has worked the same land for generations watches his fields fail. The canal that once brought water reliably is dry most of the year now. The crops wither. The harvest is a fraction of what it used to be. He can't pay his taxes. Imperial officials come demanding payment. He doesn't have it. They take what little he has: his plough animals, his stored grain, even some of his farming tools. Without these, he can't farm next year. The officials don't care. They have quotas to meet. Desperate, he abandons his land. He becomes a refugee, joining the streams of people moving from failing agricultural areas toward cities, toward anywhere that might offer survival. But the cities can't absorb all these refugees. They don't have food for them. They don't have housing. The refugees camp outside city walls, forming shanty towns, breeding grounds for disease and desperation. Some turn to banditry. What choice do they have? It's steal or starve. Bands of former farmers roam the countryside, taking what they need by force. The line between refugee and bandit becomes blurred. This is how civilizations collapse, not with a bang but with a whimper. With people abandoning homes their families have occupied for generations. With social bonds dissolving. With the basic functions of government, maintaining order and providing justice, failing. The Gutians capitalize on this weakness. Their raids penetrate deeper into Mesopotamia. They're no longer just raiding border regions. They're reaching the heartland, the areas that were supposed to be secure. Some Gutian groups settle in Mesopotamia permanently, establishing themselves as local rulers. The sources later describe this period as Gutian domination, though it's not clear that the Gutians ever established a unified kingdom. More likely, various Gutian chieftains carved out territories for themselves in the chaos of imperial collapse. The cultural prejudice in the Mesopotamian sources is strong. The Gutians are described as barbarians who don't understand civilization, who destroy rather than build. This is probably exaggerated. The Gutians likely adopted many Mesopotamian customs, governed their territories using existing administrative structures, even employed Mesopotamian scribes and officials. But they're foreign, and that matters psychologically to Mesopotamians. The idea that barbarians from the mountains could conquer the civilization that built the first cities, that invented writing, that created an empire spanning the known world, it's humiliating. It challenges Mesopotamian self-understanding. Later sources will remember the Gutian period as a dark age, a time of chaos and cultural decline. Whether it was actually that bad is debatable. But perception matters as much as reality in historical memory. In Akkad itself, the dynasty is dying. Shah Kali Shari, the last effective king, fights desperately to hold things together. He campaigns against the Gutians, against rebellious provinces, against rivals claiming the throne. For 25 years, he struggles, achieving some successes, but unable to reverse the overall trend. When he dies, around 2193 BC, the dynasty effectively ends. There are several more kings listed in the king lists, with names like Dudu and Shu-Turul, but their reigns are brief, and their authority is limited to Akkad itself and maybe a few surrounding cities. The empire doesn't collapse all at once. It's more like a slow dissolution, regions breaking away one by one, until what's left is just the city of Akkad and its immediate hinterland, ruling over a territory not much larger than a Sumerian city-state. And then, Akkad itself falls. To whom? The sources aren't clear. Possibly to Gutian attackers. Possibly to rebels. Possibly it was simply abandoned as conditions became untenable. The city of Akkad, the capital of the world's first empire, disappears from history. Its exact location is lost, not to be rediscovered despite thousands of years of searching. In a poetic sense, the capital of the empire vanishes as completely as the empire itself. What were the causes of collapse? Historians debate this, as they debate the fall of all empires. Was it climate change? Certainly environmental stress played a role, but empires have survived droughts before. The Akkadian Empire had survived climatic fluctuations earlier in its history. Was it military defeat? The Gutian threat was serious, but the empire had faced and overcome military challenges before. Sargon fought numerous wars. Rimush suppressed empire-wide rebellions. Why were these later threats fatal when earlier ones weren't? Was it political dysfunction? The succession problems, the civil wars, the breakdown of administrative systems, these certainly contributed. But again, the empire had weathered succession crises before. The truth, probably, is that it was all of these things together. A perfect storm of environmental, military, political, and economic problems, each one exacerbating the others, creating a crisis that the empire's institutions couldn't handle. Systems are resilient up to a point. They can absorb shocks, adapt to changing conditions, recover from setbacks. But every system has a breaking point. Push it beyond that point, and collapse becomes inevitable. The Akkadian Empire reached that breaking point in the late 22nd century BC. And once the collapse began, it was impossible to stop. The very interconnectedness that had been the empire's strength became a weakness. Problems in one region cascaded to others. The system's complexity, once an advantage, became a vulnerability. There's a text from this period, a lamentation, that captures the emotional tone of the collapse. It's called The Curse of Akkad, written sometime after the empire's fall, trying to make sense of what happened. The text blames Naram-Sin for the disaster. It claims he offended the god Enlil by destroying his temple in Nippur, and that Enlil responded by unleashing the Gutians as punishment. The empire fell, the text argues, because of divine wrath, because the god-king forgot that even he was subject to higher powers. Is this historically accurate? Probably not. It's theology, not history, an attempt to explain catastrophe in moral and religious terms. But it tells us something important about how people processed the trauma of imperial collapse. They needed it to mean something. The idea that the empire fell due to a combination of environmental bad luck, political mismanagement, and military pressure from mountain tribes, that's unsatisfying. It's meaningless. But if it fell because a king offended the gods, that at least provides a narrative, a lesson. Respect the gods, maintain the proper order, and such disasters can be avoided. Whether people believed this literally or saw it as metaphor, it helped them cope with loss. The empire they'd known, the order that had structured their world, was gone. They needed a story to explain why. By 2154 BC, the traditional date for the end of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamia has reverted to political fragmentation. The Sumerian cities reassert independence. Gutian groups control parts of the north and east. Various local rulers carve out small kingdoms. It's not quite the same as before Sargon. Too much has changed. The Akkadian language has spread too widely to disappear. The administrative techniques the empire developed continue to be used. The idea of empire, once planted, will never fully die. But the unified political structure is gone. The world's first empire has fallen. And in the ruins, people pick up the pieces and try to rebuild some kind of order. The Akkadian Empire lasted roughly 150 years, from Sargon's conquests around 2334 BC to the final collapse around 2154 BC. not long by the standards of later empires. Rome lasted centuries. China's imperial system persisted for millennia, but the Akkadian Empire was first. It had no template to follow, no previous examples to learn from. Everything had to be invented, and for a century and a half, it worked. That's remarkable when you think about it. The collapse was painful, catastrophic for those who lived through it. But even in failure, the empire had shown what was possible. It had demonstrated that diverse peoples could be united under a single government. That administration could function across vast distances. That empire could be more than just military conquest. Future empire builders would learn from both its successes and its failures. The Akkadian template, refined and improved, would be used again and again throughout ancient history. But for now, in the mid-22nd century BC, the experiment is over. The empire has fallen. The dream of universal rule has collapsed into chaos and fragments. And in the darkness, people wonder, will anyone ever succeed at building an empire again? Or was the Akkadian achievement a one-time miracle, never to be repeated? History will answer that question. But not yet. For now, there's only the aftermath, the slow, painful process of picking up pieces and trying to imagine a future. Chapter 9. The Fall End of an Era. There's something haunting about the final years of any great enterprise. The momentum that once seemed unstoppable has reversed. The institutions that appeared permanent are crumbling, and the people who remember the height of glory watch helplessly as everything falls apart. For the Akkadian Empire, the end comes not with a single catastrophic event, but through a slow grinding down, a gradual exhaustion of the systems and the will that held it together. By the early 22nd century BC, what remains of imperial authority is confined to an ever-shrinking territory around Akkad itself. The far-flung provinces are gone, either independent or under foreign control. The trade networks have collapsed. The administrative machinery is broken. The dream of universal rule has become a bitter memory. Let's watch the final act, not with drama or spectacle, but with the quiet sadness appropriate to witnessing something significant come to its end. The Gutians are everywhere now, not as a unified force under a single leader, but as dozens of independent warbands and chieftains, each controlling a piece of territory, each ruling in their own way. Some Gutian leaders adopt Mesopotamian customs. They employ scribes to keep records. They make offerings to Mesopotamian gods. They use titles like king in inscriptions. They're trying, in their own way, to fill the vacuum left by the empire's collapse, to create some kind of order. Others remain more traditionally Gutian, ruling through personal authority and kinship ties rather than bureaucratic systems. They tax their territories but don't really govern them in any organized sense. The Mesopotamian sources, written later, treat the Gutian period as uniformly terrible. The Gutian horde, who know no restraint, with human intelligence but canine instincts. One text describes them. It's propaganda, the prejudice of settled agricultural peoples against nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. The reality is probably more complicated. Yes, there's violence and instability. Yes, trade and long-distance commerce have broken down. Yes, some cities are destroyed or abandoned. But some communities adapt, find ways to survive, even prosper under the new conditions. Life goes on, even in dark ages. People still farm, still marry and have children, still celebrate festivals and mourn their dead. The collapse of imperial authority is catastrophic for some, liberating for others, and for most, just another challenge to navigate. But there's no question that civilization has contracted. The great cities are smaller. Literacy is less widespread. Monumental architecture largely ceases. The cultural achievements of the Akkadian period, the art and literature and administrative sophistication, fade. In the Sumerian cities, there's a strange mixture of relief and chaos. Relief, because they're free from Akkadian domination. No more tribute payments to a foreign capital. No more appointed governors from the north. Local rulers, from old Sumerian families, can claim their traditional authority again. But also chaos because there's no central power to maintain order, to settle disputes between cities, to protect against external threats. The old pattern of intercity warfare resumes almost immediately. Lagash fights Umma. Uruk fights Ur. The exhausting cycle that Sargon's conquest ended is back, and now they have to deal with the Gutians too. Some Sumerian cities make arrangements with Gutian leaders, paying tribute in exchange for being left alone. Others fight, with varying success. The political situation is fluid, constantly changing. In Lagash, a ruler named Gudea eventually rises to prominence. He's not a king in the imperial sense, just the enzi of a single city, but he's capable and cultured. Under his rule, Lagash experiences a renaissance of sorts. Temples are built. Statues are commissioned. The arts flourish. The statues of Gudea that survive are remarkable. They show him seated, hands clasped in prayer, with long inscriptions describing his building projects and his piety. They're beautiful objects, showing that Sumerian artistic traditions survived the empire's collapse. But Gudea's authority extends only to Lagash and a few nearby cities. He's not an emperor. He's not even trying to be. The age of empire, for now, is over. What happened to Akkad itself? The sources are frustratingly silent. We know the city existed. We know it was important, the capital of the world, for more than a century. And then, sometime in the late 22nd or early 21st century BC, it disappears from the historical record. Was it destroyed? Was it abandoned? Did it decline gradually into insignificance? We don't know. Archaeological surveys have tried to locate it. Somewhere in central Iraq, probably near the Tigris River north of Babylon, there should be a tell, an artificial mound created by thousands of years of human occupation. Akkad should be one of the largest tells in Iraq, given the city's importance. But despite searching for over a century, despite advanced technology and systematic surveys, Akkad hasn't been definitively identified. It's possible some tell that's been surveyed is actually Akkad, but without excavation, producing inscribed material, we can't be certain. There's poetry in this absence. The first imperial capital, lost. The city that gave its name to an empire, to an era, to a language, buried and forgotten. Future generations will walk over its ruins without knowing what lies beneath their feet. For the people who lived there, watching their city decline, the loss must have been devastating. Imagine being an old scribe in Akkad, someone who served in the administration during Naram-Sin's reign, who remembers when tribute arrived from Syria and Elam, when the markets overflowed with exotic goods, when being from Akkad meant something. Now the city is shrinking. Buildings are abandoned. The population is declining as people leave for better opportunities elsewhere. The temples still function, but the offerings are smaller. The markets are nearly empty. The glory has faded. He writes on clay tablets, recording what he remembers, trying to preserve some memory of what was. But who will read these tablets? Who will care about an empire that failed? He doesn't know that thousands of years later, archaeologists will excavate tablets from this period, that scholars will study the Akkadian language, that the empire he served will be remembered as a crucial turning point in human history. He only knows loss, the sad awareness that something great has ended. The power vacuum in Mesopotamia doesn't last forever. Political organization abhors a vacuum, and various groups try to fill it. The most successful are the rulers of Ur, a Sumerian city that manages to reassert itself after the imperial collapse. Around 2112 BC, a king named Ur-Nammu establishes what historians call the Ur-III dynasty, or the Neo-Sumerian Empire. Ur-Nammu and his successors reunify much of Mesopotamia under Sumerian leadership. It's not as extensive as the Akkadian Empire, doesn't reach as far west or north, but it's substantial, and it's remarkably sophisticated administratively, perhaps even more so than the Akkadian Empire. The Ur-III state develops an incredibly detailed bureaucratic system. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive, recording everything: worker assignments, ration distributions, livestock inventories, temple offerings. It's micromanagement on a scale that's almost obsessive. But here's the interesting thing. The Ur-III state uses many Akkadian innovations. The administrative techniques, the idea of appointed governors, rather than hereditary local rulers, the integration of diverse regions under central authority. Even the language of administration is often Akkadian, though Sumerian makes a comeback as a prestige language. The Akkadian Empire is dead, but its influence lives on. The Ur-3 state is, in many ways, the Akkadian system rebuilt by Sumerians. It's a testament to how thoroughly Sargon and his successors transformed Mesopotamian political culture. The Ur-3 state itself will last about a century before falling to new invaders and internal problems. But that's another story. For our purposes, what matters is that the period of total fragmentation after the Akkadian fall is relatively brief. Within decades, a new order emerges, building on Akkadian foundations. Let's think about what the Akkadian collapse means conceptually, beyond the immediate political and military events. The empire represented an idea that unity was possible, that diverse peoples could be governed from a single center, that order could be imposed on a large scale. When the empire fell, did the idea fall with it? No. And that's crucial. The idea survived. Future rulers would continue to think in imperial terms, to aspire to universal rule, to build administrative systems based on Akkadian models. The Babylonians, rising to power several centuries later, would claim descent from the Akkadian Empire, would style themselves as restorers of Sargon's achievement. The Assyrians, brutal conquerors who would build an empire even larger than Akkad, would look back to Sargon as a model. Even the Persians, creating the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet seen, would use administrative techniques descended from the Akkadian system. The satrap system, appointed governors ruling provinces, is fundamentally the same as Sargon's innovation. So while the political structure collapsed, while the dynasty ended, while the city of Akkad itself disappeared, the conceptual achievement persisted. Sargon had shown that empire was possible. That demonstration couldn't be undone by the empire's fall. This is the real measure of historical significance. Not whether something lasts forever, because nothing does, but whether it changes what people believe is possible. By that measure, the Akkadian Empire succeeded profoundly. There's a genre of ancient Mesopotamian literature called lamentations, poems mourning the destruction of cities. They're beautiful in a haunting way, expressing grief for fallen greatness, questioning why the gods allowed such catastrophes. One of these, The Curse of Akkad, specifically addresses the empire's fall. We mentioned it briefly in the last section, but it's worth examining more closely as we witness the end. The poem describes Akkad in its glory days, when the empire brought wealth and tribute from across the known world. It describes the markets overflowing, the ships from distant lands docking at Akkad's quays, the general prosperity. Then it tells of Naram-Sin's offense against the god Enlil, the divine punishment that followed. The Gutians are described as divine instruments sent to humble Akkadian pride. The poem ends with the city cursed, abandoned, its glory turned to dust. Akkad is destroyed. Praise be to Inanna. It's a strange ending, praising the goddess even as it describes destruction. But it reflects a deeply religious worldview where divine will explains everything, where catastrophe must have moral meaning. Whether anyone believed this literally is questionable, but the poem served a purpose. It helped people process trauma, make sense of loss, find meaning in chaos. The empire didn't just randomly collapse. It fell because of impiety, because proper order wasn't maintained. That's painful, but it's less frightening than meaningless chaos. For the last time, let's check in with our ordinary people, the ones who aren't kings or gods, but just humans trying to survive. Nin Hegel, the weaver, is probably dead by the time Akkad finally falls. If she survived the hard years of the collapse, living hand to mouth in a declining city, she would be old now, worn out by hardship. But imagine she has a daughter, also a weaver, also trying to make her way in the new reality. This daughter barely remembers the empire. For her, the stories her mother told about markets filled with goods from across the world, about stable employment and relative prosperity, they seem almost mythical. Her reality is smaller, harder. She works in Uruk now, her mother having fled there from Akkad before it fell completely. She weaves for local markets, selling to customers who can't afford much. The grand temples still commission work occasionally, but nothing like the scale her mother described from the imperial period. She's married to a farmer whose family's lands are marginal, barely productive in the changed climate. They have 3 children, though 2 died in infancy. Life is precarious. Harvests are uncertain. Violence is common. The order that once protected people from arbitrary force is gone. But she survives. She adapts. She finds small joys, her surviving child's laughter, a good harvest, a festival day. Human resilience is remarkable. Even in dark ages, life continues. Her grandchildren will live under the Ur-3 state, will experience a revival of order and prosperity. They won't remember the Akkadian Empire directly, but they'll live in a world shaped by it, using administrative systems and cultural practices that descend from it. This is how history works at the human level. Empires rise and fall, but people continue, adapting to new realities, carrying forward what's useful from the past, creating the future, one generation at a time. The Akkadian Empire is gone. The dynasty that Sargon founded has ended. The political unity he created has dissolved. The administrative systems have broken down. The cultural flowering has dimmed. But the age of empires has begun. Sargon proved it was possible to unite Mesopotamia, to govern diverse peoples from a single center, to create institutions that transcended city-states. That proof can't be erased by the empire's collapse. Future conquerors will look back to Akkad, will study what worked and what failed, will try to do better, and some of them will succeed, will build empires that last longer, grow larger, develop more sophisticated systems. But they'll all be following a path Sargon carved. They'll all be building on foundations he laid. The first empire fell, but the idea of empire survived, became part of how humans organize political life on a large scale. In 2154 BC, as the last remnants of Akkadian authority flicker out, as the city of Akkad falls silent, as the dream of universal rule gives way to fragmentation, an era ends. But even in ending, it opens doors that will never fully close again. The world before Akkad and the world after are fundamentally different. And that difference, that transformation, is Sargon's truest legacy. Chapter 10. Closing the legacy lives on. History doesn't end. It transforms, flows forward, carries pieces of the past into the future in ways both visible and hidden. The Akkadian Empire fell more than 4,000 years ago. The city of Akkad lies buried somewhere under Iraqi sand, its location lost. The dynasty that ruled the known world is extinct. The administrative systems have collapsed. The armies have disbanded. The trade networks have broken down. And yet, the Akkadian Empire never truly disappeared. Its influence ripples forward through time, shaping civilizations that came after, creating precedents and patterns that persist for millennia. The first empire may have fallen, but it left behind something more enduring than bronze weapons or mud brick palaces. It left ideas, methods, possibilities. Let's trace these legacies, following them forward through time, understanding that what Sargon began 4,500 years ago is still, in subtle ways, present in our world today. The most immediate legacy is administrative. Every empire that rose in Mesopotamia after Akkad used some version of the systems Sargon created. The idea of centrally appointed governors rather than hereditary local rulers, that becomes standard practice. The Babylonians use it. The Assyrians perfect it. The Persians, building the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet seen, deploy it across territories stretching from Egypt to India. The concept of a standing professional army, rather than citizen militias, this too becomes the norm for successful empires. An empire needs soldiers who are always ready, always trained, always loyal to the central authority, rather than to local leaders. Standardized weights and measures facilitating trade across vast distances. Economic integration as a tool of political control. Tax systems based on assessed productive capacity rather than arbitrary extraction. All of these Akkadian innovations become foundational to how empires function. The Persian Empire, rising in the 6th century BC, more than 1,500 years after Akkad's fall, is in many ways the ultimate refinement of the Akkadian template. The satraps governing provinces from a central capital, the royal road system connecting distant territories, the integration of diverse peoples under a single administrative framework, these are all elaborations of patterns Sargon established. And Persia influences Rome. Rome influences Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. The administrative techniques keep evolving, becoming more sophisticated, but the basic principles trace back to that first empire, to a man standing in Akkad 4,500 years ago, figuring out for the first time how to govern a multi-ethnic, multi-regional state. The linguistic legacy is equally profound, perhaps more so. Akkadian, the language of Sargon's empire, becomes the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for more than 1,000 years after the empire's fall. Diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and the Hittite Empire in the 14th century BC, written in Akkadian, trade contracts between merchants from different regions. Akkadian, scholarly texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, often Akkadian. The spread of Akkadian during the empire created a critical mass of speakers and a prestige association with power and learning. Even when political unity collapsed, the language remained useful, continued to spread, became the common tongue of educated people across vast distances. This linguistic unity facilitated cultural exchange. Ideas developed in one region could spread to others because there was a common language to carry them. Babylonian mathematics influenced Greek mathematics because Greek scholars could read Akkadian texts. Mesopotamian astronomical observations informed later scientific traditions because the knowledge was recorded in a widely understood language. The cuneiform script, adapted to write Akkadian, spread even further. The Hittites in Anatolia use it. The Elamites adopt it. Cuneiform becomes the dominant writing system of the ancient Near East, carrying information across centuries and millennia. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began excavating ancient Near Eastern sites, they found thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets. Many were in Akkadian. Deciphering them opened windows into ancient history, revealed details of daily life, documented the rise and fall of empires. Without the Akkadian Empire's linguistic legacy, much of ancient Near Eastern history would remain unknown to us. The language Sargon promoted became the key that unlocked the past. The cultural legacy is harder to quantify but no less real. Akkadian literature, the myths and epics composed during and after the empire, influenced later traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, refined and elaborated during the Akkadian period, became one of the foundational texts of Mesopotamian culture. It was copied, translated, adapted for more than 2,000 years. Elements of Gilgamesh appear in later mythologies. The flood story has parallels in the biblical account of Noah. The hero's quest for immortality, his friendship with Enkidu, his encounter with the divine, these themes resonate through Western literature. Artistic styles developed during the Akkadian period influenced later Mesopotamian art. The naturalism, the attention to detail, the attempt to capture individual likenesses rather than generic types, these became standards that later artists built upon. The very concept of imperial ideology, of presenting the ruler as universal monarch chosen by the gods to bring order to the world, this originates with Sargon and crystallizes under Naram-Sin. Later empires use variations of this ideology, adapting it to their own cultural contexts but preserving the core idea. Even religious concepts evolved during the Akkadian period. The syncretism, the identification of gods from different traditions with each other, the creation of a unified pantheon from diverse local cults, this approach to religious pluralism becomes characteristic of ancient Near Eastern religion for centuries. Let's think about what empire means conceptually, as an idea rather than just a political structure. Before Sargon, the largest political units were city-states. People's identities, their loyalties, their understanding of the political world, all centered on individual cities. You were from Uruk or Ur or Lagash. The idea that you could be part of something larger, that your city was just one component of a greater whole, this wasn't part of how people thought. Sargon changed that. He forced people to think in terms of empire, to imagine political communities larger than cities, to conceive of unified governance across diverse territories. This conceptual shift is irreversible. Once people know that empire is possible, the city-state system can't fully satisfy political ambitions. Ambitious rulers will always look beyond their city walls, will dream of larger dominions, will try to recreate what Sargon achieved. This pattern repeats throughout history. Alexander the Great, consciously modeling himself on ancient Near Eastern emperors, builds an empire stretching from Greece to India. Rome transforms from a city-state into a Mediterranean-spanning empire. China unifies from warring states into an imperial system that persists, with interruptions, for 2,000 years. All of these empire builders are walking paths Sargon pioneered. They have advantages he lacked, learning from his successes and failures, building on technologies and administrative techniques he couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental ambition, the dream of universal rule, the belief that unity is possible and desirable, this comes from Akkad. There's a darker legacy too, one we should acknowledge. Empire building requires violence. It requires conquest, the subjugation of peoples who don't want to be ruled by foreigners, the suppression of rebellions, the maintenance of order through force. Sargon didn't invent warfare or conquest. These existed long before him, but he demonstrated how to do it on an unprecedented scale, how to organize violence systematically, how to use military force to create and maintain political structures. Every empire that followed learned from his example, and the costs, the human suffering involved in conquest and imperial rule, these too are part of the legacy. The slaves taken in Akkadian campaigns, the cities destroyed in rebellions, the populations displaced or massacred, the resources extracted from conquered territories. These patterns repeat in later empires, often intensified, made more efficient, applied on even larger scales. We can admire the administrative achievement, the cultural flowering, the technological innovations that empires produce, while also recognizing the violence and exploitation they require. Both are part of the story. Both are part of the legacy. Let's return to Mesopotamia, several centuries after Akkad's fall, and see how people remembered the First Empire. By the time of Hammurabi of Babylon, around 1700 BC, 6 or 7 centuries after Sargon, the Akkadian Empire is ancient history. But it's remembered, celebrated, mythologized. Scribes copy old inscriptions, preserving Sargon's words. They compose legends about him, elaborating his achievements, turning him into a larger-than-life figure. The man who started as a cupbearer and became king of the universe is a perfect hero for storytelling. Later, Mesopotamian kings claim connection to Sargon. They style themselves as his successors, as restorers of his glory. The Assyrian kings, particularly, venerate him. They collect inscriptions from his reign, copy them, study them. Some Assyrian rulers even name themselves Sargon in deliberate homage. This memory preservation is crucial. Without it, Sargon would have been lost to history, just another ancient ruler whose name disappeared when his city fell. But because later civilizations valued what he represented, remembered his achievements, copied his inscriptions, the story survived. And when modern archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites, when they deciphered cuneiform and could read the ancient texts, they encountered Sargon through these later copies and references. The man himself lived 4,500 years ago, but his story reached us because people 2,000, 3,000 years ago thought it was worth preserving. In our own time, what does the Akkadian Empire mean? For historians, it's a crucial case study in how complex political organizations develop, how empires form and function, and fail. Every theory about imperial dynamics has to account for Akkad, has to explain why it succeeded and why it collapsed. For archaeologists, it's a period whose material remains illuminate the transition from city-states to larger political structures, showing how urban life, trade networks, and cultural practices evolved during the imperial period. For anyone interested in understanding how our modern world came to be, the Akkadian Empire is a key milestone. The political structures we take for granted, the idea that governance can operate across vast territories, that diverse peoples can be administered from central authorities, that professional bureaucracies can coordinate complex activities, all of this has roots in what Sargon created. We live in a world of nation-states, not empires in the ancient sense. But our political structures, our administrative systems, our ways of organizing large-scale human cooperation, these bear traces of patterns established thousands of years ago. The First Empire was also the template for empire. And empire, for better and worse, has shaped human history profoundly. Imagine standing in the desert of central Iraq, somewhere near where Akkad might have stood. The sun is setting, painting the sky in oranges and reds. The wind carries sand across ancient tells that might conceal palaces, temples, archives. Beneath your feet, possibly, lie the ruins of Sargon's city, the administrative center of the world's first empire, the place where scribes recorded tribute from Syria and Elam, where merchants gathered to trade goods from across the known world, where Sargon sat on his throne and called himself king of the universe. It's all gone now, buried, forgotten in terms of exact location, though remembered in terms of achievement. But standing there, you're connected to something profound. You're at the birthplace of an idea that changed human civilization. The idea that unity is possible, that diversity can be governed, that order can be created on a grand scale. Sargon and his empire are long dead. But the world they created, the possibilities they demonstrated, the patterns they established, these live on. Every time a government administers a large territory, it echoes Akkadian innovations. Every time diverse peoples cooperate under unified authority, it reflects patterns Sargon pioneered. Every time someone dreams of changing the world through vision and organization, they're walking a path he carved. The Akkadian Empire lasted only about 150 years. A brief moment in the vast sweep of human history, but its influence spans millennia. Ideas, once planted, take on lives of their own, growing and evolving far beyond their originator's intentions. Sargon probably couldn't have imagined how far his legacy would reach. He was focused on immediate problems, conquering cities, organizing administration, maintaining order. He couldn't have known that 4,500 years later, people would still be studying what he built, learning from his successes and failures, finding relevance in his ancient achievements. But that's the nature of truly transformative accomplishments. They transcend their immediate context, become part of the permanent furniture of human civilization, influence people and events far removed from their origin. The Akkadian Empire is gone. Long live the Akkadian Empire. Its cities are dust. Its soldiers are bones. Its tablets are fragments in museums. But the ideas, the methods, the demonstration that empire is possible, these remain, transformed, adapted, refined through thousands of years of human experience, but recognizably descended from what began in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC. We are, all of us, whether we know it or not, living in a world the Akkadian Empire helped create. The patterns of governance, the scale of political organization, the integration of diverse peoples, the administrative techniques that make modern states possible, all have roots reaching back to Sargon and his successors. The first empire fell, but the age of empires it inaugurated continues, evolving into new forms, adapting to new circumstances, but never entirely departing from the template established so long ago. As you drift towards sleep, thinking about these ancient stories, these distant peoples, remember this: history is continuous. The past flows into the present. The choices made by people who lived 4,500 years ago still influence the world we inhabit today. Sargon imagined a unified world. He built systems to make it real. Those systems failed eventually, as all human constructions do. But the imagination, the ambition, the demonstration that it could be done, these proved more durable than bronze or brick. The man from nowhere became king of the universe. The empire he built fell to dust, but the idea endures, carried forward through time by everyone who dreams of creating order from chaos, of building something larger than themselves, of changing the world. That's the true legacy of the Akkadian Empire. Not monuments or inscriptions, though those matter too, but the expansion of human possibility, the proof that great things can be attempted and sometimes achieved, the encouragement to dream big, to try the impossible, to believe that the world can be different than it is. From Sargon to us, across 4,500 years, the message echoes: transformation is possible. Unity can be built from division. Order can emerge from chaos. One person with vision and will can change everything. The first empire is gone, but its spirit, its ambition, its legacy lives on, woven into the fabric of human civilization, present wherever people organize, cooperate, build, and dream.